Hello everyone, now get comfortable and relax. The shadows in my study have grown teeth. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago when the darkness pulled in. The corners began to shift independently of the light sources that cast them. Now they stretch toward me when I'm not looking directly at them, retreating to their assigned places only when I turn my head. My rational mind, the mind of a historian trained to question, to seek evidence, tells me this is impossible. Yet the same rational mind can no longer explain the gaps in my memory or the foreign handwriting that fills my notebooks with impossible knowledge. I should never have touched the board. My colleagues at the university would laugh if they knew I'd purchased a Ouija board. Professor James Blackwood, respected medieval historian, tenure-track position at a prestigious institution, consulting with the dead like some Victorian spiritualist. But my research on the Black Death had hit a wall. Contemporary accounts were fragmented, contradictory, and the archaeological evidence was scarce. I needed something, anything, to break through. The antique shop where I found the board was tucked between a laundromat and a boarded-up electronics store. The proprietor, an elderly woman with cataracts clouding both eyes, told me the board dated back to the 1890s. Her milky gaze seemed to follow me as I examined the planchette. Its 3 felt padded feet worn from decades of use. The wood felt unnaturally cold beneath my fingertips, as if it had been stored in a freezer rather than the dusty shop I paid in cash and left without giving my name. For 2 nights the board sat untouched on my desk. I would wake to find myself standing over it in the dark with no memory of having left my bed. On the 3rd night I finally sat down with a glass of whiskey and placed my fingertips on the planchette. I felt foolish, a grown man playing at parlor games. But desperation makes fools of us all. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the empty apartment. The planchette remained still for so long that I nearly abandoned the exercise. Then it began to move slowly at first, then with gathering confidence. My heart hammered against my ribs as it spelled out a response. Yes, James. The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the draft seeping through my poorly insulated windows. I hadn't spoken my name aloud. I considered removing my hands, ending whatever this was, but curiosity, the historian's greatest virtue and most dangerous vice, kept me in place. "Who are you?" I asked. "Someone who knows you watched your mother die and said nothing." My hands jerked away from the planchette as if it had burned them. My mother had died when I was 19, a sudden aneurysm while we were alone at home. I'd frozen in panic, unable to call for help, watching as the life drained from her face. I'd never told anyone. The official report stated I'd found her already gone. My breathing came in short, painful gasps. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the room. It took me almost an hour to work up the courage to place my hands back on the planchette. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Partnership." The planchette moved with decisive confidence now, as if the entity on the other end had been waiting for precisely this question. "I have knowledge you seek. I need a place to stay temporarily." I should have ended it there. Every horror story I'd ever read or heard screamed in warning, but the promise of knowledge of answers to historical questions that had eluded scholars for centuries was too tempting. I asked what knowledge it possessed, and the planchette spelled out details about the spread of the plague that contradicted accepted historical narratives but aligned perfectly with anomalous evidence I'd recently uncovered. I asked for proof for something I could verify. The entity directed me to a specific manuscript in the university archives, citing a page number and passage that had been mislabeled and overlooked. The next morning, with shaking hands, I found exactly what it had described. A first-hand account from a physician containing details about the plague's transmission that hadn't been incorporated into historical records. That night I agreed to its terms without fully understanding what a place to stay meant. The planchette moved in a figure 8, then spelled out, "Thank you for your hospitality." I woke the next morning on my living room floor, a full 12 hours unaccounted for. My mouth tasted of copper and soil. In my study, my research notebooks were filled with pages of handwriting similar to my own, but with subtle differences. The loops tighter, the crosses on TEs made with a downward stroke rather than my habitual horizontal line. The notes contained detailed accounts of plague outbreaks with figures that couldn't possibly exist in any surviving record. I spent days verifying what I could finding, corroborating evidence in obscure sources that aligned perfectly with the mysterious notes. My research was advancing by leaps. I began drafting what would surely be a groundbreaking paper. The gaps in my memory grew more frequent. I would find myself in rooms with no recollection of entering them. Books opened to pages I didn't remember reading. My colleagues commented on conversations we'd apparently had that I couldn't recall. Professor Winters thanked me for my insights on her research into 15th century maritime trade, a subject I knew nothing about but had apparently discussed with her in great detail. My reflection in the mirror began to look wrong somehow. My face seemed subtly altered as if viewed through warped glass. When I spoke, there was a microsecond delay between my intention to speak and the words leaving my mouth. The notes continued to appear. They expanded beyond the plague, documenting historical events across medieval Europe with impossible precision. Descriptions of castle interiors that had been destroyed centuries ago, verbatim accounts of conversations between historical figures, the intimate thoughts of people long dead. I began setting up recording devices in my apartment, my phone propped against books to capture video voice recorders hidden in drawers. Most mornings I would find them disabled or mysteriously malfunctioning, but occasionally they captured fragments. My body moving with a gait, not my own. My voice speaking in cadences I didn't recognize. Sometimes in languages I had studied but never mastered. One recording caught me standing motionless in front of my bathroom mirror for over 3 hours, mouth moving in silent conversation with my reflection. When I played it back, I had to rush to the toilet to vomit. Sleep became my enemy. I would fight to stay awake, but exhaustion would eventually claim me and I'd wake to new gaps, new notes, new alterations to my life. I began to leave messages for myself, desperate questions scrolled on Post-its and taped to my bathroom mirror. Who are you? What do you want? When will you leave? Sometimes I would wake to find responses in that almost my handwriting. You know who I am. Knowledge as agreed. Temporary was the agreement. Temporary is relative. I started to lose time even while awake. One moment I would be grading papers. The next I would find myself standing in my kitchen. Hours later, a half-eaten meal I didn't remember preparing congealing on a plate before me. The sensation was like being pushed underwater, a pressure building behind my eyes until I slipped beneath the surface of consciousness. My research paper on the Black Death was published to widespread acclaim. Colleagues marveled at the depth of my research, the previously unknown primary sources I'd seemingly uncovered. Department heads from other universities began calling with job offers. I was invited to speak at conferences. My career was ascending, rapidly built on knowledge I hadn't earned. I tried to dispose of the Ouija board. I broke it into pieces and burned them in my fireplace, watching the flames turn an unnatural blue-green as they consumed the wood. The next morning, the board sat intact on my desk. Not a mark on it. I sought help from a psychiatrist, careful to frame my experiences as possible dissociative episodes. After 2 sessions, she referred me to a colleague who specialized in more severe cases. When I called the number she provided, it was disconnected. When I returned to her office, the receptionist had no record of my previous visits. The entity became bolder, my blackouts grew longer, entire days lost. I would wake to find emails I'd sent, meetings I'd attended, phone calls I'd made. Once I regained consciousness in a restaurant across town in the middle of dinner with a woman I'd apparently been dating for several weeks. She looked at me strangely when I excused myself, her expression shifting from concern to fear when I couldn't recall her name or how we'd met. The notes in my research journals expanded beyond medieval history. I found detailed accounts of the Roman Senate, of Sumerian religious practices, of Chinese dynastic court intrigues, all written with the same authoritative certainty, the same impossible first-hand knowledge. In one particularly lucid moment, I returned to the antique shop where I'd purchased the board. The storefront was now a trendy cafe with no record of the previous business. The barista, a young woman with bright blue hair, told me the cafe had been there for at least 5 years. My apartment began to change in subtle ways. The shadows grew longer regardless of the time of day. The temperature dropped in random patches. I would walk from my living room to my kitchen and feel the air temperature plummet by 20 degrees for the 3 steps in between, then return to normal. The mirrors began to show glimpses of a figure standing behind me, visible only in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look. The pressure behind my eyes grew constant. I felt as if my skin had become too tight, like a suit, tailored for someone just slightly smaller than myself. When I spoke, my voice sounded distant, as if coming from the next room rather than my own throat. I tried one last desperate measure. I used the board again, placing my trembling fingers on the planchette. "What are you?" I asked. "Historian like you. When will you leave?" "When I finish my research." "What research?" The planchette moved to spell out a date, tomorrow's date, and then perfect subject, perfect vessel. "Thank you for your cooperation." I felt the pressure behind my eyes build to an unbearable level. The room tilted sideways as I felt myself slipping beneath the surface of consciousness. Once more, I made one final effort. I grabbed a pen and paper, fighting to maintain control of my hand long enough to write, "My name is James Blackwood. I exist, I am real. I am here." I woke this morning feeling strangely light, as if a great burden had been lifted. My research has never been clearer. I understand now what I must do, how to proceed with my work. The board sits on my desk, a tool like any other. The mirrors show only my reflection, my true reflection. In my study, I found a crumpled paper with a single line of messy, desperate handwriting. "My name is James Blackwood. I exist, I am real. I am here, poor James." So concerned with his individual identity, so attached to his limited perspective, he doesn't understand the gift I've given him. Access to history as it actually happened, not as it was recorded by the victors or the survivors. I am a historian in the truest sense of the word. I have witnessed what he can only study from a distance, and now I will continue my work through him. Documenting what I have seen across the centuries, this body will serve my purposes well enough. It's young, healthy, with a promising academic career ahead. The brain contains useful knowledge of modern historical methodologies, and no one has noticed the change. Humans are remarkably unobservant when it comes to the subtle shifts in those around them. The transition is nearly complete. Just a few fragments of James remain like bubbles trapped under ice. Soon they too will fade. His fear was unnecessary. I've kept my end of the bargain. I've given him the historical knowledge he sought. The fact that he's no longer present to use it is merely an unfortunate detail. After all, I did say my stay would be temporary. Temporary for me simply means something different than it did to him. A century or two in this form. Before I need to find another vessel is but a moment in the span of history I have witnessed. I run his. Our fingers over the smooth wood of the Ouija board. Already I can feel other historians reaching out through similar objects, seeking knowledge, willing to make bargains. Time to begin my work. So much history to record, so many secrets to share eventually. Story 2. The first time I noticed it, I dismissed it as a trick of light. A smudge on my lens, perhaps in the corner of a wedding photo I'd taken for the Morrison account. A dark silhouette, blurred but unmistakably human. Shape standing apart from the guests, I deleted it and reframed the shot, blaming my equipment. A professional photographer for 15 years, I'd seen every kind of technical glitch. But this was something different, something I would soon learn to fear. My name is Daniel Weiss. I document people's happiest moments, weddings, anniversaries, graduations, and for most of my career, that's all my camera ever captured until 3 weeks ago when everything changed. After the Morrison wedding, I noticed similar anomalies appearing in my work. A dark figure, always distant, always watching. Each time I spotted it, my chest tightened and a chill ran through me. At first, it lingered at the edges of crowded scenes, barely noticeable among groups of people. I could rationalize it away, but with each new photograph, the figure appeared closer, more defined. Its featureless face became the focal point of images where it had no right to exist. I spent hours examining my equipment, searching for some technical explanation. I took my camera apart, cleaned every component, replaced the lens, but the figure persisted. One evening, sorting through photos from a corporate event, I noticed the figure had moved from the background to stand directly behind a group of executives. My hands trembled as I zoomed in. Though still blurry, I could make out what appeared to be a tall, thin man in dark clothing. His face remained a smudge of shadow, but I sensed he was looking directly at the camera directly at me. My apartment felt suddenly cold. The hairs on my neck stood up as I glanced toward my darkened living room windows. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a reflection there. Not my own, but something elongated and dark. When I blinked, it vanished. My heart hammered against my ribs as I closed all the blinds and checked the locks twice. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every passing. Cars' headlights casting shadows across my ceiling jolted me awake. My mouth was dry, my sheets damp with sweat. By morning, exhaustion had left me groggy and paranoid. I canceled my appointments for the day and dedicated myself to reviewing every photo I'd taken in the past month. The pattern was undeniable. The figure, whatever it was getting closer in each successive image. In the most recent photos, it stood just behind the subjects, towering over them. Yet somehow, unnoticed by everyone except my camera, I contacted my colleague Lisa, asking if she'd ever encountered anything similar. She laughed off my concerns, suggesting I was overworked or that someone was playing an elaborate prank. I wanted to believe her, but the cold weight in my stomach told me otherwise. As we ended our call, Lisa mentioned that I looked terrible and should get some rest. She asked if I was sleeping well lately. I admitted I wasn't, carefully omitting why. That night, I took a sleeping pill and collapsed into bed. When my alarm blared at 7 a.m., I felt a momentary relief at having slept through the night. But as my vision cleared, I noticed my laptop was open on my desk. I distinctly remembered shutting it down before taking my pill. My body felt like lead as I forced myself out of bed. Each step toward the desk filled me with increasing dread. The screen displayed my photo management software, open to a folder I didn't recognize. With trembling fingers, I clicked on the first image. It was me asleep in my bed. The photo had been taken from the doorway of my bedroom. My lungs constricted as if gripped by an invisible hand. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. I clicked to the next image. Another shot of me sleeping. This one closer, taken from the foot of my bed. Timestamp 3:02 a.m. I scrolled through dozens of similar images, each one bringing the photographer closer to my unconscious form. The final photo, timestamped 5:43 a.m., showed me from directly above, filling the frame. And there at the edge of the image was a long, dark finger reaching toward my face. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. My breaths came in short. Painful gasps as I searched my apartment, throwing open closets and checking behind furniture. I was alone, but the sensation of being watched pressed down on me like a physical weight. I called in sick to my afternoon wedding shoot and spent the day researching similar phenomena online. I found nothing conclusive, just paranormal forums filled with dubious accounts and amateur theories. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation, a security breach in my computer sleepwalking, or perhaps a mental health issue triggered by stress. My friend Marcus, a computer security specialist, agreed to look at my laptop. He found no evidence of hacking, but seemed troubled by my demeanor. He suggested I see a doctor, mentioning words like paranoia and possible hallucinations in a carefully measured tone. I nodded along, knowing how it all sounded, but also knowing what I'd seen. That evening, I set up motion-activated security cameras around my apartment and took a stronger sleeping pill. I left all the lights on and fell into a chemical sleep. The piercing alarm of my phone woke me at 3:17 a.m., a security alert with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I checked the footage. The camera in my living room had detected movement. The video showed my empty living room, the shadows from streetlights creating patterns on my walls. Then something shifted in the corner, a darkness deeper than the surrounding shadows. It moved like smoke fluid yet purposeful toward my bedroom door. The footage ended abruptly. I sat frozen. Sweat beating on my forehead, my mouth so dry I couldn't swallow. The bedroom camera hadn't triggered. Whatever had entered my room hadn't registered as movement. Morning arrived after hours of sitting upright in bed, back pressed against the wall. Eyes fixed on my bedroom door, sunlight diffused through my blinds, revealing an ordinary room. No evidence remained of my nighttime visitor. Exhaustion clouded my judgment. I needed to work to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I had a session booked with the Clarks for their anniversary portraits in the park. My hand shook so badly I struggled to mount my camera on its tripod. The shoot proceeded without incident until I reviewed the first batch of images on my camera's display. Behind the smiling couple, partially hidden by a tree, stood the figure. No longer just a shadow, I could make out a tall, gaunt form in what appeared to be an outdated black suit. Its face remained obscured, but I sensed its attention fixed firmly on me. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Clark asked. Noticing my sudden pour, I made some excuse about the lighting and quickly wrapped up the session, promising to send them their photos soon. As they walked away, I frantically scanned the park. No sign of anyone matching the figure in my photo. Driving home, I checked my rear view mirror compulsively. Twice I thought I glimpsed something. Dark in the back seat, but when I pulled over to check, I found nothing. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. My shirt soaked through with sweat. By the time I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and immediately transferred the Clark photos to my computer. The figure appeared in every shot, though from different positions. In the final image, it stood directly behind me, visible in the reflection of a decorative park fountain that had caught the edge of the frame. My legs gave out. I collapsed into my chair, tremors running through my body. The room seemed to tilt and sway around me as I stared at the screen. In the reflection, the figure's hand rested on my shoulder, though I'd felt nothing. At the time, I called Dr. Reynolds, an old client who'd given me his personal number. After I photographed his daughter's wedding, he agreed to see me immediately. Throughout the drive to his office, I felt a presence in my peripheral vision, a dark shape that vanished whenever I turned to look directly at it. The doctor listened patiently to my account, his expression betraying nothing. He examined my eyes, checked my blood pressure dangerously high, and ordered blood tests. He spoke carefully about stress-induced psychosis and prescribed medication that would help me rest. I never mentioned the photos. I knew how it would sound. That night, I swallowed the pills he'd given me before sleep claimed me. I remembered to turn on my camera and place it on my nightstand lens facing the bedroom door. A desperate plan formed in my sedated mind. If I could capture clear evidence of the entity, I could prove I wasn't losing my mind. I woke to sunlight streaming through my windows. For a brief, beautiful moment, I felt normal until the memory of recent events crashed back. My camera, I grabbed it from the nightstand and checked its memory. 27 new photos had been taken throughout the night. My hands shook violently as I viewed them one by one. The first few showed my empty doorway. Then a darkness gathered at the edge of the frame. In subsequent images, the figure took shape, tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what I could now clearly identify as a black suit from another era. Its face remained obscured, not by shadow, but by a strange distortion, as if reality itself warped around where its features should be. The sequence showed it approaching my bed in agonizing increments. In the final image, it stood over me, one long-fingered hand reaching toward the camera. The distortion around its head had partially cleared, revealing what might have been eyes' dark hollows that seemed to swallow light. I hurled the camera across the room with a hoarse cry. It shattered against the wall pieces, scattering across my floor. I spent the day in a daze, jumping at shadows, flinching at every unexpected sound. By evening, I'd convinced myself to leave my apartment. I booked a hotel room downtown under a false name. packed a bag, and drove through the city in a meandering route, constantly checking to ensure I wasn't followed. The hotel room offered temporary relief, new surroundings, no history. I took a long shower, ordered room service. I couldn't eat and sat watching mindless television until midnight. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. The sound of my phone camera's shutter woke me. My eyes snapped open to darkness. My phone hovered above me, held by a hand that wasn't mine. The screen illuminated a small portion of my hotel room, enough to see that I wasn't alone. I lay paralyzed, unable to scream or move, as the phone lowered toward my face. Behind it, I caught a glimpse of the now familiar distorted visage. The phone's screen showed a photo it had just taken of me, wide-eyed with terror, looking up at the camera. With a surge of desperate energy, I lunged for the bedside lamp and switched it on. Light flooded the room, revealing nothing. I was alone. My phone lay on the bedside table where I'd left it. When I checked it with trembling hands, I found no new photos. Had I dreamed it, the line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. I checked out at dawn and drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself at the city library when it opened. Hidden away in a quiet corner, I researched photography and the paranormal. Most accounts were obviously fabricated or easily explained, but one article caught my attention. A piece about spirit photography from the late 1800s. It mentioned a particular photographer who claimed his camera could capture entities from the other side. His descriptions of these entities matched what I'd been seeing. According to the article, the photographer eventually disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His final journal entry, partially quoted, mentioned a presence that had crossed over through his camera's lens, an entity that had found a way in through the aperture's eye. My blood ran cold. The article included a blurry image of the photographer himself, a thin man in a dark Victorian suit. The revelation hit me with physical force. I wasn't being haunted by some random entity. The figure in my photos was the photographer himself, or what remained of him. Somehow he had become trapped between worlds using cameras as a portal, and now he had found me. Another photographer, another potential vessel. I drove to a remote overlook outside the city. My mind racing, the sun set in a blaze of orange and red as I contemplated my options. I could destroy my cameras, abandon photography altogether. But would that stop what had already started? The entity had already manifested in my phone and security cameras I didn't own. It had found a way through. As darkness fell, I noticed a strange glow from my bag. My backup camera, I'd forgotten I had it with me. I approached cautiously and unzipped the bag. The camera was on its display screen, glowing. It showed a live view of the overlook where I stood, but from a position several feet behind me, I spun around. Nothing was there. When I looked back at the screen, the image had changed. Now it showed me from the front, as if the camera shooting the image was floating in the empty air before me. A notification appeared on the screen. Transfer all images to new host. Win. My finger hovered over the display. In that moment, I understood the photographer hadn't just found a way to manifest through cameras. He was looking for a replacement, someone to take his place in that liminal space between worlds, allowing him to fully cross over. I picked up the camera, feeling its weight in my hands. Years of my life dedicated to capturing moments, preserving memories. Had I opened myself to this, somehow created a connection through my obsession with seeing what others missed? The screen flickered, the question still waiting for an answer. Behind it, I caught my first clear glimpse of the photographer's face. Gaunt, desperate, with eyes that had seen too much. I raised the camera to eye level, pointing it out toward the darkened landscape. Through the viewfinder, I could see the city lights in the distance, bright against the night. Beautiful, worth capturing. My finger moved to the shutter button instead of the screen. If the aperture had let something in, perhaps it could also let something out. I began taking photos, dozens, hundreds of the night sky, the distant city, the trees around me. With each press of the shutter, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The weight of observation that had pressed on me for weeks began to lift. When I finally lowered the camera, I was alone on the overlook. The screen had gone dark. When I turned it on again, the strange question had vanished. Just my camera responding normally. I don't know if what I did that night freed me or merely bought me time. Sometimes reviewing my recent photos, I think I catch a glimpse of something in the background. Not the photographer, but something else. Something watching from much farther away. I still practice photography. But differently now, I understand the responsibility of the lens, the portal it opens between observer and observed. Some moments aren't meant to be captured, some things aren't meant to be seen. And sometimes when I raise my camera to my eye, I can't help but wonder what exactly is looking back through the aperture. Story 3. The first symbol appeared on the third night of my rotation. A crude etching in the bark of an ancient oak still fresh enough that sap wept from its edges like amber tears. I traced my flashlight over the intricate pattern, concentric circles bisected by jagged lines that didn't seem random. Something about it made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just kids. Bored teenagers from the nearby town defacing park property. But even then, in those first innocent moments, something whispered in the back of my mind that I was wrong. Terribly wrong. My name is Michael Harlow, and for the past 11 years I've worked as a night guardian at Blackwater State Forest. The job suited me. The solitude, the quiet, the gentle communion with nature at its most vulnerable hours. I've always preferred the company of trees to people finding peace in their silent wisdom. Most nights passed in comfortable routine, patrolling the marked trails, checking the camping sites, documenting wildlife activity, and occasionally redirecting lost hikers or shooing away rowdy youngsters. Nothing in my experience had prepared me for what began that autumn. The symbol bothered me more than it should have. I photographed it, reported it to my supervisor during the morning handoff, and tried to put it out of my mind. Vandalism happened occasionally. It was part of the job. But that night back in my small guardian cabin, I found myself sketching the symbol from memory, unable to shake the sensation that I'd seen it somewhere before. 2 nights later, I found another one carved into a different tree nearly a mile from the first. Same pattern, same depth, same fresh cut sweeping sap. This time, standing before it in the crisp night air, I felt watched. The back of my neck tingled, hairs standing at attention like silent sentinels. I swept my flashlight through the surrounding darkness, but the dense forest swallowed the beam after 30 feet. Something moved at the edge of that light, a shadow shifting against shadow. My heart rate accelerated, pounding against my ribcage like it wanted escape. I called out, voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. No response came, but the silence itself seemed charged attentive. I backed away, maintaining sight of the symbol until I reached the main trail. That night I slept poorly, awakening repeatedly to phantom noises outside my cabin windows. By the end of the week I'd found 7 symbols. Management sent someone to remove them, but each carving was replaced within days, appearing in the exact same location but cut deeper more deliberately. I began recording my nightly patrol's standard procedure for documenting unusual occurrences. At first, the recordings captured nothing but my breathing footsteps, crunching on fallen leaves and occasional commentary. But reviewing them the following morning, I caught something I'd missed. Beneath the ambient forest, sounds barely audible were whispers. I enhanced the audio straining to make sense of the faint sounds. They weren't English. They weren't any language I recognized. The syllables slithered and twisted, consonants stacking impossibly upon each other. I played them for Ranger Martinez during shift change, but she heard nothing unusual. Just wind and distant animals, she said. The concern in her eyes wasn't for the recording, but for me. She suggested I take a few days off. I didn't. Instead, I began sleeping with my recorder running. The first arrangement appeared the next morning. I discovered it upon opening my cabin door, a careful construction of twigs, pine needles, and what appeared to be small rodent bones, arranged in a pattern that mirrored the tree carvings. My hands trembled as I photographed it, then swept it away with my boot. The violated feeling that washed over me was visceral. Whatever was doing this had been at my door while I slept. That night the shadows seemed deeper. The forest sounds muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. 2 hours into my patrol, I heard it. Footsteps behind me on the trail matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. Always maintaining the same distance, I spun around repeatedly, flashlight beam cutting desperate arcs through the darkness but found nothing. Then I saw it for the first time. Between two ancient pines, perhaps 50 yards off the trail, stood a figure, tall, impossibly tall and thin, with skin so pale it seemed to absorb my flashlight's glow rather than reflect it. It didn't move. It simply stood watching. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew with sickening certainty that it was looking directly at me. My body reacted before my mind could process what I was seeing. I ran breath tearing from my lungs in ragged gasps, branches whipping against my face as I abandoned the trail for a more direct route back to my cabin. Inside doors locked and curtains drawn, I huddled on my bed, shaking violently, clothes soaked with cold sweat. My heart hammered so hard I feared it might rupture. I played back the night's recording. Through my panicked breathing and footfalls came that whispered language again, closer now, clearer, and at the moment I'd seen the figure. The whispering stopped, replaced by a single, clearly enunciated phrase that made my blood freeze in my veins. I couldn't understand the words, but their meaning reached some primal part of my brain. I see you now. The arrangements grew more elaborate each morning. Twigs and bones gave way to complex sculptures incorporating feathers, stones, and unidentifiable organic matter. They appeared not just at my doorstep, but at every entrance to the cabin windows, the rear service door, even the small bathroom skylight. I documented everything meticulously, sending daily reports that received increasingly delayed and dismissive responses. Management suggested wildlife cameras, which I installed only to find them disabled. Each morning, memory cards wiped clean, my sleep deteriorated until I existed in a half-waking state of perpetual exhaustion. The dreams, when they came, featured the pale figure standing motionless at the foot of my bed or leaning over me. Face always obscured, but somehow communicating intense hunger. I began taking stimulants to stay awake during my shifts, caffeine pills washing down my throat with lukewarm coffee. The third week brought escalation. The symbols now covered entire sections of forest. Every tree in a 100-y radius marked with the same intricate pattern. The night recordings captured not just whispers, but a low melodic humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. And the figure, the pale watcher, grew bolder, appearing multiple times during my patrols, each sighting closer than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was testing boundaries, learning my routines, my reactions. My supervisor suggested it might be a local playing an elaborate prank. When I showed him the recordings he claimed to hear, nothing unusual. The frustration tightened my chest like a vice. Even Martinez, previously sympathetic, began avoiding my gaze. During handoffs, I installed additional locks on my cabin doors. I lined the windows with salt, an old superstition from my grandmother. I kept a hunting knife under my pillow and a heavy flashlight within arm's reach. None of it helped the feeling of being constantly observed, even inside my supposed sanctuary. My mouth remained perpetually dry no matter how much water I drank. My hands developed a persistent tremor that made even simple tasks difficult. The night, everything changed. I was halfway through my patrol route when every sound in the forest ceased simultaneously. The sudden silence hit like a physical blow, disorienting in its completeness. Even the persistent autumn wind died, leaving the trees motionless, expectant. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then went out entirely. The darkness pressed against my eyes like a living thing. I fumbled for my backup light, fingers clumsy with dread. Before I could activate it, I sensed, rather than heard movement behind me, a displacement of air, the subtle shift of weight on forest soil. Hot breath touched the back of my neck, carrying an odor of decay and something else, something ancient. My muscles locked in primal terror. Fight or flight response short-circuited by the overwhelming certainty that turning around meant death. The whispers came directly into my ear, no longer requiring recordings to be heard. The language remained incomprehensible, but the intent behind the sounds reached me clearly. A litany of promises, an invitation, a claim being staked. My consciousness began to fray at the edges, the world dissolving into static and shadow. I don't remember running. I don't remember reaching my cabin. My next clear memory is sunrise, finding myself curled in the center of my bed, still fully dressed, clutching my knife so tightly my fingers had cramped into claws. On the floor surrounding the bed was a perfect circle of that same arrangement, twigs, bones, stones, and feathers, but this time incorporating scraps of fabric I recognized from my own uniform. I called in sick the first time. In 11 years, I spent the day researching, obsessively searching for meaning in the symbols for any record of similar occurrences. Local indigenous folklore mentioned forest spirits that tested the resolve of those who entered their domain, but nothing that matched what I was experiencing. Anthropological texts described ritual markings used in rites of passage or territorial claims by ancient cultures, some bearing superficial resemblance to my symbols. It was in an obscure academic journal that I found something truly relevant. A case study from 1978 documenting similar phenomena experienced by a forestry worker in northern Michigan. The article included crude sketches of symbols identical to mine. The worker had been found wandering miles from his post, severely dehydrated and suffering from acute psychosis. He spoke only in fragments of a language no linguist could identify and died 3 days later from what doctors termed sudden and catastrophic organ failure. The article's conclusion suggested environmental factors, possible, hallucinogenic fungal spores or contaminated water, but noted the case remained largely unexplained. My stomach clenched as I read the final paragraph, which mentioned the worker's journal containing repeated references to the Pale One who watches and the claiming ritual. That night I broke protocol I was supposed to patrol, but I barricaded myself in the cabin instead. Windows and doors secured with everything movable I possessed. I set up my phone to record the entire night from multiple angles. Then I waited, knife in hand, back against the farthest wall. The whispers began at midnight, seeping through the walls as if the cabin itself was speaking. My recording equipment, malfunctioned batteries draining instantly. The temperature plummeted until my breath clouded before me. Outside, something circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, its footsteps heavy yet precise. At 3:17 a.m., every arrangement I'd swept away over the past weeks appeared simultaneously inside the cabin, materializing like time-lapse photography. They formed a pathway from the door to where I stood. The door handle turned slowly, the multiple locks disengaging one by one with soft clicks. I raised my knife as the door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. A darkness deeper and more absolute than the night should allow. From within that void, the pale figure emerged, unfolding into the doorway like something being born. It was taller than should be possible, its limbs two long joints bending at unnatural angles. Its face remained in shadow despite the proximity. My knife clattered to the floor, my legs gave way. I pressed against the wall, a whimper escaping my throat as the figure took one impossible step forward, crossing the threshold into my final sanctuary. It spoke not in whispers now, but in a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly within my skull, though I still couldn't understand the language. Images flooded my mind. Ancient forests untouched by human hands, rituals performed beneath moonlight by people long turned to dust. The same pale figure watching from the trees across centuries, and most disturbingly myself. Seen through eyes, not my own, being observed, evaluated, and finally selected. I understood then this wasn't random. I hadn't stumbled upon something by accident. It had been waiting, watching. All the years I'd worked these woods, biding its time. The symbols were not warnings, but preparations. The arrangements were not threats, but components of a larger working. The whispers were not meant to frighten, but to acclimate me to hearing them. The realization brought neither comfort nor greater fear, only a strange clarity I had been chosen for something. The claiming ritual, the journal had called it. As the figure reached for me with impossibly elongated fingers, time seemed to stop. In that suspended moment, I made a choice born not of courage, but of the sudden understanding that I had always belonged to these woods, far more than to the world of men. I raised my own hand to meet its reaching grasp. Morning found me walking the forest paths physically unchanged, yet fundamentally altered. The symbols remained on the trees, but now I understood their meaning. Boundary markers, signposts, a language older than human speech. The arrangements still appeared outside my cabin each dawn, but I recognized them as offerings. Acknowledgement steps in a process still unfolding. I continue my patrols each night. I file my reports. I maintain the appearance of normalcy during shift changes. Martinez has stopped looking concerned and started avoiding me entirely. I don't blame her. Something in my eyes has changed. I've caught glimpses in mirrors and still ponds. The recordings now capture only forest sounds. No whispers, no footsteps. I don't need technology to hear what speaks directly to my mind. The pale figure walks with me now rather than watching from afar, teaching me things. No human was meant to know, showing me paths through the forest that didn't exist. Before I understand, I'm becoming something other than what I was. The process is gradual but irreversible. Soon I will leave symbols of my own for the next guardian to find. I will stand motionless among the trees watching. I will whisper in a language older than time. And perhaps if they are worthy, if they belong to the forest as I did, they too will be chosen. Until then, I walk my paths. I tend my woods. I guard boundaries far more significant than those drawn on any human map. The forest has always needed guardians. Now I understand why. Story 4, from the moment I set foot in that isolated Italian village, an unsettling heaviness seemed to settle between my shoulders. The air felt charged, as though infused with secrets whispered by the ancient stone houses pressed close against one another. I remember looking up at the narrow windows, each casting a dim-skewed light onto the cobblestone paths. A faint breeze hissed in the cracks of the walls, and I could swear it carried the echo of a sigh, something forlorn and strangely charged with foreboding. My heart pounded with a disconcerting rhythm, and I felt a sudden dryness in my mouth like I had swallowed a handful of dust. Little did I know that this sense of looming unease would only intensify once I reached my new residence, a centuries-old home perched at the far end of the village. There, the boundaries between sanity and impossibility would begin to blur as the silent gloom of the house revealed the bizarre manipulations of gravity that threatened my understanding of reality. I traveled to that remote region of Italy with the intention of escaping distractions and finishing my latest manuscript. The house I rented was rumored to have once belonged to an astronomer obsessed with forces invisible to the naked eye. I had seen photos online, tall, narrow windows, thick stone walls that might keep out any noise, and a small tower that supposedly once held a rudimentary telescope. At first glance, it struck me as charmingly eccentric, the perfect setting to inspire the final chapters of my novel. Yet, as soon as I arrived, something in the atmosphere weighed on me. I still recall how my hands trembled slightly when I first gripped the doorknob. It turned with a harsh squeal, releasing the odor of damp stone and old wood. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, feeling a momentary rush of vertigo as if the floor dipped half an inch. My head spun, breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was just the fatigue of travel and the echoing hush of an unfamiliar house. The hallway stretched out in front of me, illuminated by a single weak bulb that sputtered against the thick darkness. I remember letting out a shaky exhale and wondering if perhaps I needed fresh air. But some strange magnetism drew me further in. I soon discovered the bedroom on the upper floor just below, the old observatory tower. It was fairly modest. A single wooden bed, a dresser with tarnished handles, and a small rectangular window that offered a view of the main square. There was a large wooden beam across the ceiling that looked worn and scuffed, as if it had been struck repeatedly by something heavy over the years. The bed's mattress sagged in the middle. The sheets smelled faintly of stale air, and yet I felt oddly compelled to stay there. Perhaps in part because I had heard the rumors that storms in this region brought with them peculiar atmospheric disturbances. Since I was writing a work of fiction that toyed with the boundaries of the supernatural, I thought a front-row seat to dramatic weather might spur my imagination. That first night as I lay down, the house was eerily silent. Even the creaking that old houses often make seemed subdued, like it was holding its breath. My pulse was a persistent throb in my temples, and my skin broke out in a cold sweat. Though I didn't feel hot, I drifted into a shallow, agitated sleep. At some point, I felt pressure at my shoulders, a sensation so sharp that it jolted me awake. It felt like a firm hand had shoved me downward against the mattress. My heart slammed in my chest. I opened my eyes in the darkness, unable to see anything but the vague outline of the ceiling. Adrenaline flooded my veins, my breathing ragged and too loud in my ears. The pressure vanished as suddenly as it appeared. I rubbed my eyes, struggling to calm the pounding in my chest. In the morning, I told myself it had been a dream. I wandered the house searching for any sign of intruders. Every footstep echoed against the stone floors. Eventually, I found a stack of ancient documents in a room I presumed was once a study. The pages were tattered, yellowed by time, scribbled in thick, spidery handwriting that I recognized as Latin. My knowledge of the language was minimal, but I could decipher a few phrases referencing astral forces and manipulation of gravity. The name of the astronomer, Vittorio Benedetti, was repeated often. I spent the next few days trying to settle in. I wrote for hours in my makeshift study, but my focus continuously slipped. My nerves refused to settle, like 1,000 insects crawling just beneath my skin. I often heard faint scraping noises late at night. And once, while walking across the living room, I felt a subtle lift in my body, as though my next step was lighter than it should have been. For a brief moment, my stomach lurched like it does when an elevator drops too fast. My heart hammered so violently that I had to steady myself against a wall. Another day, I watched a pen roll off the table onto the floor. Instead of bouncing and settling under a chair, it wobbled once on the wooden planks, then hovered a few inches above the ground before dropping. My immediate reaction was disbelief so strong I felt chilled to the marrow. My arms erupted in goosebumps and a peculiar ringing filled my ears. I blinked several times as though my eyes might have played a trick on me. But deep inside, I knew I had just witnessed a breach of physics. By the end of the week, the strangest event yet occurred. I woke in the middle of the night to the deep rumble of thunder. Rain battered the windows. A howling wind pressed against the walls, and sporadic flashes of lightning illuminated the bedroom. I felt an intense vibration in the air, something that prickled against my skin. All at once, I realized that some of my belongings were drifting off the tabletop: a small notebook, a water bottle, even a pen. They hovered as though suspended in thick liquid, rising slowly, then bobbing downward. My jaw clenched so tightly I could feel my teeth grinding. For a moment, I simply stared in shock, sweat beading on my forehead. Then, with a pulse of lightning, everything crashed to the floor, leaving me trembling in a wide-eyed horror. My pulse raced so fast it hurt. I retreated to the corner of the room, unable to tear my eyes away from the scattered objects. Rain hammered the roof, and with every flash of light, I sensed the room tipping sideways. The door rattled, and I felt as if some unimaginable force was turning the house inside out. Each inhale felt tight and forced my lungs struggling to fill with air that seemed electrified. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat there with my back pressed to the wall, drenched in cold sweat, watching and waiting for the next impossible occurrence. A few days later, I discovered more writings hidden in a small chest. These pages spoke explicitly of Benedetti's experiments. He had dissected mathematical theorems, scrolled star charts, and recorded what looked like instructions for ritualistic procedures. Some lines mentioned binding Earth's power to the celestial sphere. Another referred to an inversion of natural laws during storms, and there were repeated references to invisible hands. One note mentioned that gravitational anomalies were strongest in that house, and that lightning seemed to trigger them. I felt a deep chill, reading it as though my very blood had turned to ice. My body trembled, and I realized my breathing was shallow. Anxiety nagged at me, telling me that perhaps I should leave. But a strange fascination tethered me there. My sense of time grew distorted. The gloom pressed in constantly, and I found myself peering out the narrow windows at the villagers outside. They went about their days under drizzling rain and low gray skies. I tried to speak with a local in the small cafe about the weather, but he only lowered his gaze, murmuring that in storms the old house had its peculiarities. I recall how his voice shook almost imperceptibly, as if there were things better left unspoken. The conversation left me with a crawling sensation along my spine, my stomach twisting. One evening, while I tried to work on my manuscript, I heard a sound like metal scraping against metal. My heart lurched. The lights flickered, and I realized they cast odd, twisted shadows on the walls as though something was warping the angle of illumination. The house seemed to groan. The overhead beam creaked like it might split in two. A rush of nervous energy propelled me out of my chair. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance when the floor felt like it tilted beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my head pounded with dread. That's when I noticed water dripping from the kitchen faucet, but not downward. The droplets slithered upward toward the ceiling. I stood there, mouth parted, unable to form a coherent thought. Sweat dampened the back of my neck. My mind raced, searching for logical explanations that would not come. The water collected in a shimmering pool against the ceiling, defying every natural law I knew. Suddenly, the lights winked out. Darkness swamped the house. My breathing roared in my own ears. In a flash of lightning from the window, I caught a glimpse of the water now swirling along the ceiling, defying gravity. The house itself quivered as if it were alive and responding to the storm's electricity. Thunder cracked so close it shook the windows. Without conscious decision, I found myself scrambling up the stairs, clinging to the rail as the steps seemed to shift under my feet. My entire body felt shaky and weak. I was drenched in sweat, mouth dry with fear. Reaching the top, I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Lightning illuminated the corridor, revealing the door to the bedroom slightly. Ajar inside, I glimpsed something that made my heart flutter with raw terror. The bed was pinned to the ceiling, or more accurately, it appeared the ceiling had become the floor for certain pieces of furniture. I can't forget how my hands trembled, how my breath caught painfully in my chest. Another flash of lightning lit the space, and I realized I had my feet planted on the ceiling too. It took a second for my brain to register the impossibility. My vantage point had inverted, my insides twisted. I felt disoriented, as though stuck in a nightmare. I tried to step forward only to stagger sideways. The entire world had flipped, but my mind still screamed that this could not be happening. A deep thrumming sound coursed through the walls. My vision blurred momentarily, and my stomach lurched with nauseating force. I don't recall exactly how I managed to steady myself, but after several disorienting moments, the gravity shift snapped back. I fell, landing hard on the actual floor with a jolt that rattled my teeth. Every muscle in my body spasmed, and I let out a sharp animalistic grunt. My heart pounded so loudly I could swear it echoed in the corridor. The bed crashed down, thudding violently. Objects scattered in all directions, and the floorboards vibrated as if in protest. A primal fear took hold. I thought about abandoning the house right then, but the raging storm made the idea of running blindly into the night. Horrifying as well, I cowered in a corner, gasping for air. The sour taste of panic thick in my mouth. My vision spotted with black dots from hyperventilating. My mind teetered on the edge of disbelief and terror, replaying those moments of inversion over and over. Hours might have passed in that dark corner. At some point, the storm began to relent and the house grew still again. I dared not move until faint dawn light seeped through the windows, illuminating the carnage of upended furniture and scattered belongings. In the following days, I tried to make sense of it all. The documents I'd found hinted that Benedetti had discovered a way to warp gravity triggered by Storm's electrical charges. I felt convinced that his experiments had imprinted themselves on the very structure of the house. Yet a part of me wondered if I was suffering from some form of hysteria or neurological breakdown. Paranoia plagued me. I second-guessed my every step. Whenever a breeze rattled the shutters, my heart would leap. If a flickering shadow crossed the walls, sweat would break on my brow and I'd whip around, lungs tight with dread. There were moments when I couldn't trust the simplest sensations. If I put a cup on, the table and heard it clink. I half expected it to float away or smash against the ceiling. My sleep became a twisted battleground of half-formed nightmares. I jolt awake to the slightest sound, my skin-clammy ears ringing. The taste of bile in the back of my throat. I started scribbling notes in the margins of my manuscript describing the precarious line between reason and madness, the feeling of being stalked by forces that recognize no rule of nature. I saw shadows move where there were no people. I felt a presence behind me in the corridors as though invisible hands were reaching out close enough to graze my skin. Sometimes I told myself these were panic-induced hallucinations, but deep down I believed the house was responding to my fear, feeding off it, twisting it into sharper claws. One stormy afternoon, the sense of looming danger became too much to bear. I felt the walls closing in, and I swore I could hear whispered equations in the wind. My clothes clung to my sweating body, and my pulse hammered in my skull. I paced the living room in a state of mounting agitation. Anxiety coiled in my gut like a venomous snake. When thunder shook the foundation, I let out an unsteady breath and made the decision to leave. I stuffed some belongings into a bag, grabbed my key, and yanked the door open. Rain whipped against my face, but I barely felt it. I raced down the steep path, my skin prickling with the maddening sensation that gravity might invert again at any second. Reaching the edge of the village, I glanced back at that ancient house. Lightning silhouetted the old observatory tower, and for an instant the entire structure looked like it was bending in on itself as though drawn by a powerful vacuum from above. My heart thundered and goosebumps rippled across my arms. I felt dizzy, almost compelled to watch, but terror spurred me onward. I slipped into the safety of a small inn at the far side of the village and huddled there, breathing in short, uneven gasps, teeth chattering from more than the cold. The innkeeper, noticing my ashen face, asked if I was all right. I must have mumbled something incoherent about the storm in the house. My voice unstrained, though I kept direct conversation minimal, I hinted that the building was not fit for habitation. The innkeeper's expression told me he'd heard it before, yet he offered no solution, only a solemn shake of his head. In the aftermath, as the storm subsided and the gray morning light filtered through the cracked shutters of the inn, I realized I could not return to that place. Even if my manuscript remained unfinished, even if my belongings lay scattered across the house's floors and ceilings, I couldn't risk another night there. The memory of water crawling upward toward the rafters and furniture pivoting in midair was lodged in my mind. I felt a constant tremor in my hands and my lungs still constricted with the phantom fear of suffocation. Yet as I sit here recounting these events, I am left with a lingering, unsettling question. Did I experience genuine distortions of the physical laws, or did I unravel under isolation and relentless storms the village's history? Benedetti's writings, the eyewitness anomalies, they all suggest something real, something monstrous in its defiance of nature. But part of me still wonders if the house merely unlocked a latent hysteria in me, set loose by the claustrophobic hush of a small Italian village and the gloom of my own imagination. That uncertainty gnaws at me even now as I keep a solitary lamp lit through every dark hour. Sleep comes fitfully, if at all. Every thunderclap brings me back to that lonely bedroom pinned to the ceiling, praying for a world that remains upright. Though I manage to flee the house, its imprint shadows me. My nights are plagued by images of objects floating in silent defiance, by a suffocating tension that wraps around my chest until my breath shudders. And the worst part is not knowing if I escape for good, because sometimes I catch the reflection of a door or a chair in the corner of my eye. And for a split second it seems to hover at the edge of vision just a few inches off the ground, suspended there by a force older than reason. Every storm that passes overhead makes my pulse hammer in my throat, a cold sweat slicking my palms. Even miles away from that cursed house, I can't shake the feeling that my grasp on gravity is fragile. It's a disquing thought that during the next tempest I might find myself once again treading the ceiling, powerless and consumed by the impossible. Perhaps that is Benedetti's final legacy, an enduring terror that logic cannot dispel. leaving me to question each breath, each step, each beat of my racing heart. Story 5. I still remember how my heart pounded the first time I realized something was wrong with that old radio. It was late at night, and a sickly orange glow spilled through the cracks of my dusty curtains, casting twisted shadows on the walls. The air felt uncomfortably still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I was sitting at my workbench tinkering with a small circuit board when I heard static sputter to life from the corner of the living room. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, distinct crackling and all too real. I bought the radio at an estate sale a few weeks before, drawn in by its vintage design. Its polished wooden casing reminded me of something from an old family photograph. And as an electrical engineer, I'm always intrigued by older technology. Initially, I planned to restore it as a personal project. Maybe replace some tubes, fix the dial, and see if I could get it running on modern power. I didn't anticipate that it would power itself on, and I certainly didn't expect the warnings, the strange voices, and the overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone in my own home. The first real sign that something was off happened the day after I brought it in. I was in the basement, testing a new amplifier design, and I heard faint music floating down the stairs. It sounded like an old swing tune playing from the living room. Naturally, I assumed I just left the radio plugged in. But when I went upstairs, the radio was indeed switched off. No lights on its panel, no tubes glowing inside, nothing. Yet I was certain I'd heard it. My skin prickled and a chill ran down my spine as I realized the radio wasn't even connected to an outlet. Brushing off the incident as an echo from somewhere else in the neighborhood, I decided not to dwell on it. Over the next few days, small disturbances began piling up. I'd be reading on the couch and feel an abrupt temperature drop behind me, as if a cold draft had floated by. Lamps would flicker, though the wiring in my house was up to code. Doors would make subtle creaking noises when no one had touched them. My heart raced whenever these things happened, and I'd catch myself unconsciously holding my breath. There was always this unnerving sensation that something lingered in the corners of my vision, but the radio was the focal point of my growing unease. Every time I passed by, a low hum would tickle my ears, too faint to be absolutely sure, but present enough to send a ripple of goosebumps across my skin. I tried turning it on intentionally one afternoon to see if I could replicate the bizarre flickers of activity. The dial lit up, tuning into a station that played static and occasional snippets of old broadcasts. Nothing too unusual until the voice started speaking. It was just a snippet of a sentence, something about being careful. Spoken in a low tone that crackled through the speakers. My throat went dry and I felt an anxious flutter in my stomach. I couldn't tell if it was a broadcast from some distant station or if it was coming from somewhere far stranger. That night I left the radio unplugged again, but placed a small recorder next to it, hoping to capture any random bursts of sound. However, when I checked the recorder the next morning, the device's battery was completely drained. This was the same recorder I'd fully charged an hour before I set it down. Irritated but intrigued, I replaced the batteries and tried again, only to find the replacement batteries dead in less than 5 minutes. My palms started to sweat as I realized something was interfering with my equipment. As a lifelong skeptic, I tried to approach the problem systematically. I wanted a logical explanation. Faulty wiring, electromagnetic interference, maybe a short circuit that caused battery drain. But the more I tested, the less sense it made. I used my multimeter to check for current leaks. Everything was normal. I dismantled the radio, only to find the components worn but intact, as though they were quietly waiting to be powered. Nothing inside the casing suggested an obvious mechanical fault that would cause spontaneous activation. Each time I touched the radio's wooden frame, though, a slight shudder ran through my arm as if I'd touched a live wire. Then came the warnings. They were faint at first, like garbled static shaping itself into words. Late one evening, I heard it sputter to life on its own. At the time, I was in the kitchen checking the phone for messages. When I heard that hiss and crackle, I darted to the living room. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breathing hitched in my throat, and my hands began to tremble. Leaning in, I heard what sounded like an urgent plea. something about not letting it through. It was muffled, but the underlying desperation in the voice made my scalp prickle. I tried to record it once more, but this time my phone's battery drained from 80% to nothing in seconds. My temples throbbed with frustration and a rising sense of dread. The more the radio spoke, the more bizarre occurrences began happening around the house. The lights in the hallway started flickering in patterns like Morse code. The living room window would rattle even on a still night. I heard echoes of conversations that seemed to come from rooms I wasn't occupying. But whenever I checked, those rooms were empty. Sometimes it sounded like 2 or 3 people whispering urgently, though I could never make out their exact words. On one particularly disconcerting night, I heard a conversation drifting from the radio that seemed to originate in my own bedroom. The voices had a muffled, distant quality, as though transmitted through layers of static. I heard them discuss a presence in the house. They mentioned me by name, but the tone was frantic, as if they were trapped. My heart pounded so violently I could feel my pulse vibrating in my teeth. I raced upstairs, half expecting to catch intruders, but the bedroom was dark and empty except for the shape of my bed looming in shadows. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, and cold sweat trickled down my forehead. My attempts to ignore these occurrences only made them stronger. Something was trying to warn me, or perhaps trying to lure me deeper into this mystery. I found myself avoiding the living room at night. The radio's presence in the darkness felt like a threat, even though I had no proof of anything malicious, just an insidious sense that it was more than a piece of old technology. My dreams turned restless. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard faint whispers from behind the walls. Shadows in my peripheral vision took on the shape of tall figures in corners, vanishing the moment I turned my head. My appetite diminished, and I found myself skipping meals because my stomach was in a constant knot. Every time I tried to approach the situation logically, some new inexplicable event would shred my rational framework. One morning I heard soft thuds from the attic. It sounded like light footsteps pacing in a tight circle. I had never stored much up there, just a few boxes of old electronics. As I climbed the creaky steps, fear made my legs quiver. Each step pounded like a drumbeat in my chest. At the top, I flicked on my flashlight. The beam revealed dusty beams of wood and scattered cobwebs. The space was empty, but I felt a pressure in the air like static on my skin, causing every hair on my body to stand on end. My flashlight flickered twice, then died despite fresh batteries. In that instant, something brushed against my shoulder, an icy electric jolt that sent me stumbling backward, nearly losing my balance on the narrow steps. Back downstairs, I grabbed the radio and placed it on my workbench, determined to disassemble every last component. My hand shook as I removed the back panel. The tubes were mostly original. The circuitry looked old but functional. Something glimmered in the corner of the casing. It was a fragment of metal etched with symbols I didn't recognize, bizarre inscriptions that made my pulse pound. I tried to pluck it out, but my vision blurred and a wave of nausea swept over me. I slumped to the floor, breath-heaving ears ringing as if I'd just been exposed to an intense frequency. When the dizziness passed, I realized I was drenched in a cold sweat. The piece of metal was nowhere to be found. I could have sworn I'd seen it seconds earlier. Yet there I was alone in the workshop, feeling as though I'd lost track of time. I started to suspect that the radio wasn't simply broken. It felt as though it housed something, a presence, an energy, maybe even something sentient. Every logical bone in my body resisted that idea, but my experiences were too consistent to dismiss. I tried confiding in a friend over the phone, describing the static, the drained batteries, the frightening voices. He thought I was just stressed out from work or perhaps lonely. He told me I should get out of the house for a while. I realized that was probably a good idea, but an invisible tether kept me tied to the radio. I couldn't abandon my home, and I couldn't leave that thing unobserved. In the ensuing days, the messages on the radio became clearer. Late at night, I heard someone or something uttering phrases about darkness creeping in, about a doorway opening. The voice was labored as though it struggled to speak through layers of interference. The correlation between the radio's warnings and the incidents in my house became impossible to ignore. Right after the radio crackled a foreboding phrase about not letting it grow stronger, my bedroom light surged with a bright flash and then died. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might faint. I started double-checking door locks, leaving lamps on, and meticulously examining every corner of the house. My nerves were frayed and my paranoia grew. The sense of being watched became unbearable. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'd hear faint breathing near my bedroom door. Other times, I'd feel a cold pressure on my chest as I tried to fall asleep, as though someone were leaning over me. Every noise, every flicker of light felt like the house was taunting me. In the pit of my stomach, I carried an unshakable dread, as if something was about to go terribly wrong. In a desperate attempt to regain control, I set up a new recorder with an external power source that theoretically couldn't be drained so easily. I positioned it near the radio and waited until the next time it flared to life. Sure enough, around midnight, static hissed from the speaker, followed by insistent whispers. Gathering all my courage, I sat there, refusing to move. My heart slammed against my ribcage, sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and my hands felt numb. The whispers continued for a few moments, then rose in volume until they were nearly deafening. Suddenly, the overhead light burst in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. My breath came fast and shallow, panic clawing at my throat. I tried to switch on a flashlight, but it refused to turn on. Fighting the trembling in my fingers, I groped around for my phone, which still had a full battery earlier in the evening. Dead. The intangible pressure in the air intensified like a wave of static electricity that set my nerves on fire. Then, just as abruptly, the whispers stopped. The radio turned silent. In that nauseating stillness, I felt an immense presence in the room, as though I were no longer the only occupant. My skin crawled with the certainty that something stood right behind me, unseen yet undeniably there. I turned slowly, my limbs shaking as if they weighed 100 pounds each. The darkness was absolute, but a faint silhouette seemed to flicker just outside my field of vision. My senses reeled, my mind struggling to process the impossible. Every breath felt like shards of glass scraping down my throat. I couldn't think, couldn't move. I was paralyzed by pure terror. Then, in a rush of adrenaline, I lunged for the circuit breaker, flipping every switch, trying to flood the house with light. When it returned, the living room looked as it always did, except for the broken glass from the overhead bulb. The radio sat there inert, mocking me with its silence. I'd had enough. The next morning, I decided to remove this sinister device from my home once and for all. But as I prepared to wrap it up, a final surge of static emanated from the speaker. My eyes darted to the dials. They were glowing faintly, even though the radio was unplugged. A voice, calm, measured, and eerily familiar, delivered one last cryptic statement. It said something about the presence being bound to the place, not the object. My entire body went cold as I realized removing the radio might not solve anything. That final message felt like a warning and a grim confirmation that whatever I'd awakened was rooted in the house itself. For a moment, I considered calling someone to bulldoze the place, or at least hiring a team of investigators to check for electromagnetic anomalies. But part of me knew that no conventional approach would drive out this insidious force. Instead, I gathered my tools and prepared to confront it. I wrapped the radio in thick plastic sheeting and locked it in the basement closet, sealing it away. The air still felt heavy, and I could sense that the house's energy had not diminished. That night, I paced the corridors, flicking lights on and off, waiting for the presence to manifest. Oddly, it never did. The oppressive feeling was still there, but it seemed distracted, if such a thing were possible. Tension lingered in every corner. The next morning, I woke up with an odd calmness in my chest, as though a storm had passed but left the sky bruised and unsettled. The radio stayed silent in its makeshift tomb. Yet I couldn't shake the idea that something remained watching and waiting. I decided to leave the house for a few weeks, gather my courage, and consult some references on haunted phenomena or at least talked to more experienced engineers who had tackled unexplainable electromagnetic issues. Before I left, I stood in the living room one last time, feeling the thick silence press down on me. Every fiber of my being urged me to run to get away from the intangible darkness that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. As I locked the front door, I glanced back through the window. My eyes were drawn to the spot where the radio had once stood. The living room was draped in half-light from the rising sun. Dust motes swirled lazily in the air, and for a second I swore I saw a shadow pass across the space. My throat went tight and I felt that sharp chill again. There was no one inside, yet the unmistakable impression of a figure remained outlined in the dim glow I left anyway. Uncertain of what I had truly experienced, I'm still uncertain. Perhaps it was all a trick of stress and isolation, or maybe I'd truly encountered something beyond rational explanation. Even now, I feel an uncomfortable heaviness in my chest whenever I think about that house. Whatever lurked there, it had fed off my fear, revealing itself little by little through the radio's static. And though I'm far away now, sometimes I still hear faint crackling in the silence like a distant broadcast. It makes my heart race and my stomach churn. In those moments, I wonder if my attempts to contain the radio were futile, if the presence has already latched onto me somehow. I don't know if it can be defeated, banished, or scientifically explained, but its warning remains etched into my memory that it is bound to the place, not the object. That house may remain forever haunted by its malevolent occupant. My only solace is that I escaped before it could fully manifest itself. Yet the question that keeps me awake at night is whether we ever truly escape something like that, or if it finds new ways to follow us, whispering through the wires and frequencies we can't quite understand. The dread lingers in every quiet moment, every flicker of electricity reminding me that some presences simply wait in silence until they decide to speak again. Story 6, and the hallway lights flickered the moment I unwrapped that battered old code, as if the building itself recognized an intrusion from some other age. I remember the peculiar hush that fell over the corridors in that instant. A hush that felt thick and unnatural, like the air was watching me. An inexplicable sense of dread settled in my chest, as though I'd opened a portal to something that should have remained sealed. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and an odd tension stretched across my shoulders, urging me to toss that garment aside. I couldn't say why, but from the very first moment I laid eyes on it, I had this instinctive feeling. It didn't belong to me, or to any living person for that matter. I am a professor of literature, a man who makes his living parsing the nuances of novels and poems. My world has always been defined by crisp, well-organized thoughts, by rational interpretations of text, and by neat delineations between fact and fiction. But ever since I draped that vintage coat over my shoulders, my understanding of reality has begun to blur. This story might sound like the ramblings of someone on the brink of madness. Perhaps that's exactly what it is. Yet I feel compelled to tell it, if only to rid myself of the growing sense that my thoughts are no longer entirely my own. I first acquired the coat at a small antique store near the university campus. The shop was one of those cramped, dimly lit places crammed with relics from centuries past. Usually I don't bother with apparel from secondhand stores, but something drew my gaze to that faded olive green garment hanging in the corner. The proprietor, an elderly man with a distant expression, told me the coat had once belonged to someone notable. He didn't elaborate much, but his eyes had a strange glint when he handed it over. I felt a mild shiver as I slid it on, but I assumed the coat was just cold to the touch. It was only later that I began to suspect it was not the chill of the fabric, but the chill of some intangible presence latched onto it. At first, wearing the coat felt oddly empowering. The heavy wool draped over my shoulders like a regal mantle, instilling a faint but noticeable change in my posture. I found myself walking with more confidence, almost strutting through the halls of the university. Colleagues commented that I seemed more energetic. Some even asked if I'd been working out or taking new vitamins because I stood taller, spoke more assuredly. My heart would flutter with an unfamiliar excitement. It was thrilling to have my peers see me in a new light. Then the nightmares started. They were fleeting at first. vague flashes of an earlier era, gaslit streets, people dressed in clothes from the turn of the century, horse-drawn carriages rattling down cobblestone roads. In my dreams, I was always a man of influence, someone with weight in that older society I felt recognized and disturbingly revered. Yet there was a grayness to these visions, a leaching of color that suggested something grim hovering around the edges. Each time I woke up, my mouth was parched, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and my sheets were tangled around me as if I'd wrestled with them throughout the night. The next morning, when I slipped my arms into the coat sleeves, it felt like an embrace from someone who wanted me back in those dreams. Strange objects started appearing in the coat pockets. The first discovery was a small envelope sealed with old-fashioned wax, inside of which I found a brittle piece of parchment. The text was nearly illegible, written in an archaic style of calligraphy. My hands trembled as I tried to decipher it. The words that jumped out were references to a binding an oath and an inheritance. I felt a bead of cold sweat on my forehead as I realized I recognized the script from my nightmares. My rational mind kept trying to tell me it was nothing more than a curious leftover from the antique shop, but a deeper intuition hissed that something more sinister was at play. A few days later, I discovered a pocket watch, ornate tarnished silver, its cover etched with swirling patterns. When I touched its surface, my chest constricted. The sense of déjà vu was so strong that I stumbled backward. It was like I had held that watch 1,000 times before. Though I knew I hadn't, I tried to rationalize these finds. Perhaps the store owner had forgotten to empty the pockets. Perhaps these items were planted as a marketing ploy to enhance the coat's mystique. But then came the biggest shock of all. I started having memories that didn't belong to me. It would happen in short bursts, always triggered by seemingly random stimuli. While standing at my office window, gazing at the modern campus, my mind suddenly replaced the view with the scene of an older courtyard. Grand arches, marble pillars, a stone walkway leading to a large mahogany door. I could feel a crisp wind on my skin, smell the distant coal fires, and hear the dull clop of hooves on cobblestone. My heart hammered violently and my breathing grew ragged, sweat trickling down the back of my neck. When the vision faded, I was left shaking, uncertain whether I had hallucinated or simply daydreamed, yet it felt so undeniably real. Soon, colleagues and friends began noticing subtle shifts in my behavior. One evening, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment. I remember someone asking for tea, and I answered with a distinctly different inflection, an archaic tilt to my phrasing. The group went silent. My best friend told me afterward that I spoke with an accent that sounded like something from an old European play. I brushed it off, murmuring some excuse about being lost in my research. But deep down, I felt panic rising. My chest was tight, my fingertips tingling with dread. It was as if my body was no longer wholly under my own control. In the mirror's reflections started to distort. It began as quick flashes. I would catch sight of a figure wearing a formal waistcoat and bow tie instead of my usual shirt. The reflection for a fraction of a second had a different hairstyle slicked back as though from a bygone era. My lungs seized as if I'd forgotten how to breathe, and I would clutch the edge of the sink, dizzy and disoriented. Each time I'd close my eyes, take a few desperate gulps of air, and when I looked again, I'd see myself rumpled professor's attire, messy hair, the coat slung on the hook behind me, but the fleeting glimpses left a creeping horror in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that the coat wasn't just influencing me, it was rewriting me. Walking through campus, I found my gaze lingering on old architecture. Suddenly, the modern library seemed garish, the neon lights of the student lounge too brash. I developed an affinity for candlelight, finding the overhead fluorescence abrasive to my senses. My speech patterns shifted too. Students looked at me quizzically when I used phrases that seemed plucked out of a historical novel. In class, my chest would constrict with dread as I realized I was referencing texts that weren't on any current syllabus books, that to my knowledge never existed in this timeline. My heart rate spiked each time and I could barely swallow past the dryness in my mouth. I felt a wave of embarrassment, but I also felt fear at how naturally these anachronistic references rolled off my tongue. The worst moments were at night. The heater in my apartment would sputter and hiss, producing noises that made me think of footsteps creaking on old floorboards. I'd lie in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, heart thrashing in my chest as the wind rattled my window. Sometimes half asleep, I imagined an old Victrola playing scratchy melodies from another era. My breath would catch in my throat and I'd break out in a cold sweat. Uncertain if I was dreaming or truly hearing the faint echo of that music. The darkness pressed in thick and suffocating, and I would toss and turn, the coat laid across a nearby chair like a silent sentinel observing me. Its silhouette outlined against a streak of moonlight seemed watchful. My sense of self continued to unravel the day I found an old photograph tucked inside the coat's inner lining. It showed a group of people standing outside a stately turn-of-the-century building. My blood went cold when I recognized one of the faces. It was me, but not me. The person in the photo had the same eyes, the same jawline. He stood with pride wearing the very coat I had recently acquired, though the edges of his form looked faintly faded as though time itself was trying to erase him. I felt my knees buckle and I had to sit down, gasping for breath. My mind spun, trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe a distant relative, an uncanny look-alike. Yet deep down, a horrified voice whispered that this was the original owner and I was becoming him. I began to suspect the coat carried some curse, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. On several occasions I attempted to throw it out. I'd stuff it into a plastic bag, seal it tight, then walk to the dumpsters behind my building, heart hammering with each step. Yet I always found an excuse to turn around. My chest would tighten with an irrational terror, and I'd break into a clammy sweat. The coat feeling heavier and heavier in my arms, I'd hurry back to my apartment, suffused with overwhelming relief the moment I hung it back on the rack. The sensation of compulsion was terrifying, like something outside my rational mind was controlling me. My breath would catch my heart pounding, and I'd stand there trembling, wondering what force had such a hold over me. One late evening, as I paced around my study, I felt compelled to try it on. Once more, I told myself it was to research the phenomenon to understand the garment's malevolent hold. But the minute I slipped my arms into its sleeves, a wave of unfamiliar memories washed over me. I saw roaring fireplaces, tasted the bite of brandy on my tongue, and smelled the musty scent of old libraries. My entire body shook. My mind was a storm of images, some exhilarating in their intensity, others terrifying in their implications. My vision blurred and I stumbled. When I looked at my hands, they were gloved in fine leather for a moment, though in reality I was barehanded. That night I could hardly sleep. When I finally dozed off, I dreamt I was signing a ledger in that archaic script with a quill pen. My signature was not my own name, but the name of the coat's original owner, like I was relinquishing my identity. My chest felt as if it might implode from panic. The room itself in my dream was shadowy, flickering with candlelight, and something about it was suffocating. I sensed an unseen presence behind me, guiding my hand, urging me to complete that signature. When I woke with a strangled gasp, my heart was galloping and my hairline was damp with sweat. My entire body trembled and my stomach churned. It took me several long moments to remind myself I was in my modern apartment. Not some distant century. I decided I had to seek answers. One afternoon I cornered the shop owner, the same man who had sold me the coat. I asked about its history, but he was evasive. He mentioned hearing rumors that the coat was tied to an old estate across the sea, but he provided scant details. He simply offered a faint shrug, indicating he had no more information. I felt my throat go tight with frustration. My mouth was so dry that I could barely form words. I pressed further, but he merely averted his gaze and mumbled something about not prying into matters best left alone. Upon returning to my apartment, I decided on a drastic measure. I would lock the coat away in a trunk. Perhaps if it wasn't within view, its influence would weaken. For a while it seemed to work. I felt a measure of relief. My nights were less plagued by haunting visions, although I still woke up sweating and uneasy. At least I didn't see that figure in the mirror as often, but the respite was temporary. One night I found myself standing before the trunk. my fingers working frantically at the lock without any memory of getting out of bed. My heart pounded at my own actions, my breath shallow. I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. It felt like I was the puppet of some spirit that refused to be sealed away. I decided that was the final straw. I had to confront this. If the coat was cursed, it was time to break that curse. Gathering all my courage, I took it from the trunk and carried it outside, determined to burn it. I chose a desolate spot near the edge of town where no one would question a small fire. The air was cold and a biting wind cut through my clothes, but my forehead was slick with sweat. My heart felt like it might leap out of my chest. As I piled dry branches for the fire, a distant thunder rolled and the world seemed to hold its breath. I placed the coat on top of the makeshift pie, my fingers trembling so much I nearly dropped my lighter. Just as I flicked the flame to life, an inexplicable wave of dread seized me. My vision blurred and I felt disoriented as though the ground beneath me shifted. I braced my hand on a nearby rock to steady myself. For a split second, I thought I saw that older world again looming behind my eyelids. Those cobblestone streets, the flicker of lamplight. My breathing became so shallow I thought I might faint. Yet I gritted my teeth and forced myself to set the branches ablaze. The fire crackled to life, smoke swirling in ghostly plumes. For a moment it seemed as if the coat resisted. The flames licked its surface, but the fabric did not catch as quickly as I expected. A bizarre sense of panic welled up in me as if I were betraying something vital. The heat intensified and my eyes stung from the smoke. My heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing in my temples. Finally, the coat began to smolder, blackening around the edges. A sharp odor filled my nostrils. Something sour like charred wool, tainted by a strange chemical tang. My skin prickled and a shiver of revulsion ran the length of my spine. In the dancing glow of the flames, I imagined I saw a figure rise from the coat shape, briefly coalescing before dissolving into the swirling smoke. My vision swam with ghostly after images, and my entire body trembled so violently that I nearly collapsed. But I forced myself to keep watch to ensure the garment was truly reduced to ashes. Long minutes passed, then gradually the coat disintegrated into charred remnants. I felt a sudden emptiness, like a severed link between me and that presence had been torn away. Afterward, I stared at the smoking remains, heart hammering. My breath was still ragged, and I realized how close I had come to being consumed by something beyond reason. As I trudged home, I was drenched in sweat despite the frigid air. I half expected the shadows to close in on me or for the echo of footsteps to follow. Yet nothing came. I was alone, and the quiet was almost unbearable. In the days that followed, I felt an extraordinary sense of relief, though the nightmares still lingered on the edges of my consciousness. My reflection sometimes flickered in the mirror as if uncertain whether it should show my modern self or that haunting visage from another time. But with each passing night, the illusions grew less frequent and the coat's hold seemed to wane. My accent returned to normal and my old habits resurfaced. People who had noticed my strange behavior commented that I seemed more like myself again, though a bit pale and forever glancing over my shoulder. I wish I could say I found closure. The truth is, I'm not entirely convinced the coat is gone. A part of me worries that when I burned it, I only scattered its essence, releasing it into the wind to drift into unsuspecting hands. From time to time, I still wake at odd hours, heart-hammering, convinced I hear that archaic voice in my mind. I've even checked my closets in a cold sweat, expecting to see that olive green outline, but the coat has never reappeared. Whether the curse is broken or just lying dormant, I cannot say. Every so often, I still feel a flicker of that other personality within me, a faint echo of a life that's not my own. My reflection in dark windows sometimes wears a ghostly half-smile, and I sense eyes, my own eyes, scrutinizing me from another era. The tension coiled in my gut never fully relaxes, and the weight of the unknown presses on my chest. Even though I am free from its immediate influence, the mere memory of that thing is enough to keep my heart pounding in a slow, fearful rhythm. I continue on with my life, teaching my courses, grading papers trying to reestablish the solid sense of reality I once had. But I sense that the boundary between my identity and that long-dead owner's has been permanently frayed. Maybe I escaped, or maybe I just allowed a piece of him to take root in me. Night by night, I managed to keep that part of my mind at bay, whispering to myself that I am who I've always been, that my thoughts belong to me alone. Yet sometimes late at night, I catch a glimpse in the mirror and see a different shape in my eyes, an unfamiliar glimmer that doesn't quite belong, and I can't tell if it's just my imagination or the lingering presence of a life I once feared would become my own. Story 7. I still remember the first night back in that old house, standing on the creaking porch with the wind howling as though it carried secrets. The air seemed unusually dense, as if the shadows themselves held their breath. My heart thumped once, then again with a slow, deliberate force that made the silence feel alive. That raw awareness rushed over me, a lingering sensation that something within those walls had been waiting. I took one shaky step forward, trying to steady my breathing, yet every exhale seemed to vanish in the cold night. Swallowed by the darkness looming behind the door, I had inherited the property after it sat abandoned for several years. Coming back wasn't exactly a choice, but more of a reluctant duty. I felt an unexplainable pull, a compulsion, as if the house refused to let me ignore it any longer. Despite all the time that had passed since my youth, the layout was startlingly familiar. Even the chipped paint on the banister remained unchanged. The same pattern of cracks I once traced with my fingertips in restless moments. On that first night, I turned on the lights in the foyer and listened to them buzz and flicker. The air smelled of stale wood and dust. My chest tightened as I noted a curious sense of expectancy. The feeling that something was watching from the corners. I tried to dismiss it as mere nerves. After all, old houses often play tricks on the mind. Squeaks in the floorboards, moaning pipes, the hush of wind seeping through cracks. But that night, even the walls seemed to exhale a faint, otherworldly murmur. As I ascended the stairs, each step groaned under my weight like a plaintive whisper protesting my presence. The corridor upstairs was darker than I remembered, and the overhead light switch refused to work. My stomach knotted with a growing unease, my pulse beat against my temples, creating a soft roaring in my ears. While fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight, I sensed a faint electric hum in the air around me, like static electricity raising the tiny hairs on my arms. The phone briefly glowed before flickering off, then on again, as if it too fought against some invisible resistance. In my old bedroom, I could almost see the imprint of my earlier life, a battered desk, a narrow bed, and a closet door that never closed properly. The sight of those objects triggered a wave of nostalgia, yet that wave quickly receded, leaving behind an unsettling chill. The overhead light worked, casting harsh shadows on the walls that seemed to stir whenever I blinked. Exhaustion weighed me down, so I tried to sleep, telling myself that everything would seem less ominous in the morning, but sleep was elusive. Around midnight, I heard a faint melody echo through the house, an old lullaby that I vaguely recognized from my younger years. The notes were warped, as if coming through a distorted radio frequency. My heart hammered in my chest. I got up, following the sound to the hallway, only to find silence. The melody vanished the moment I stepped outside the bedroom. A cold sweat formed on my forehead, my hands trembling. I returned to my bed feeling more anxious than before, my breathing shallow and quick. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me, making it impossible to rest. The next morning, I explored the house more thoroughly. Dust coated every surface. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges. I tried to open a window for fresh air, but it was jammed as if swollen shut with time. In the kitchen, I discovered that several appliances behaved strangely. The refrigerator hummed loudly, its interior light flickering. The old radio on the counter seemed to switch stations on its own, briefly catching a signal that whispered a voice I couldn't make out. Instead of direct words, it felt more like a presence breathing through static. My nerves were frazzled by the early afternoon. I decided to rummage in the attic, searching for items left behind. The attic steps creaked in protest, and a cold draft seeped from above. I coughed against the dust swirling in the stale air. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and I cautiously opened one after another, half-heartedly flipping through old photo albums and random trinkets. It was then that I found a weathered book with a cracked spine, an old diary. My pulse quickened as soon as I touched it. The cover felt oddly warm, and a tiny shock of static buzzed against my fingertips. Reading the diary was a slow, uneasy process. The handwriting varied, suggesting multiple authors had used it over the decades. Strange entries caught my attention. Accounts of voices drifting through corridors, lights flickering without cause, and a subtle force trying to communicate through seemingly ordinary household devices. A line read, "It wants someone to stay. It tries to recreate memories." My skin prickled. Another entry mentioned, "Every occupant hears echoes of their earlier life in the walls and the static in the phones. It seeks a permanent companion." My breathing grew ragged. I could almost hear my heartbeat echoing off the cramped attic walls. I felt a swirl of fear and curiosity. Was I simply following the same footsteps as the previous residents as night fell? I kept my phone close, yet it behaved erratically. Notifications popped. Disconnected landlines that suddenly rang with a voice mimicking old acquaintances. Televisions that turned on by themselves to play reruns of beloved shows. That occupant concluded that the presence was desperately seeking a companion, someone who would merge with it in a timeless loop of relived moments. By the time I closed the diary, my hands were trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts. My knees felt weak. It struck me like a blow. The presence was systematically orchestrating events from my younger life, even if I had buried those memories. The lullaby on the phone, the flickering lights reminiscent of certain late nights spent in that same room, the hidden details from my earliest days. The entity was trying to make me feel at home in a warped, possessive sense, as though it believed this would forge a permanent bond. That evening, I left all the lights on and brewed coffee to remain alert. I settled in the living room phone at my side, determined not to be caught off guard. Around midnight, my old laptop, which I had powered off earlier, suddenly booted up by itself. The screen glowed with faint lines of text crawling across my chest, tightened as I approached it. The text repeated fragments of the diary's final entries. The lines scrolled like a silent script, culminating in a single phrase that flashed over and over. "Stay with me." I staggered backward, my heart pounding so violently that I feared it might burst. A surge of adrenaline rushed through me. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse thrumming in my temples. My vision blurred slightly, and I had to steady myself against the wall. It was as though the house had found a new way to speak. I slammed the laptop shut, but even then I swore I could still see the faint glow seeping from beneath the lid. A sense of nauseating dread flooded my stomach. My mind spun with questions. How long had it been planning this? Had it guided me here, or was this purely coincidence? I retreated to the bedroom, seeking at least the illusion of safety. The covers provided little comfort. I felt exposed, as if the walls were pressing in, or the light bulb above me was an eye fixed on my every move. When I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my dreams were filled with distorted images of the house itself. Doors opened onto infinite hallways, flickering with the same glitchy hum as a corrupted video file. I woke multiple times, drenched in cold sweat, heart-hammering mouth bone dry, shaking uncontrollably. The question pounded in my skull. Was it just my mind unraveling, or was there truly something in the house orchestrating these horrors? A few days later, I returned to the attic with a surge of determination. If the diary contained more clues, I had to find them. My mouth tasted of stale fear, and every slow breath felt like a victory against my own galloping anxiety. Ransacking the corner where I found the diary, I unearthed more papers, old letters, and scribbled notes from earlier occupants. One letter mentioned attempts to bargain with the entity trying to leave while it slept. Another note suggested setting up cameras, but the cameras only captured static or random bursts of light. All of them spoke of a creeping terror that grew day by day until it was unbearable. One letter recounted that each occupant eventually fled, leaving possessions behind as if the house's oppression had become too suffocating. Nobody had explicitly mentioned death, but the writer's fear and desperation practically bled from the pages. My arms trembled as I read, and I had to sit for a moment. The atmosphere felt stifling, as though the attic were filling with invisible smoke. My lungs fought for air that seemed far too thin. I realized that the entity thrived on familiarity, weaving illusions from personal memories. It was feeding on my fear, my recollections of the house and every moment of electrified tension. It wasn't content with scaring me. It wanted me to stay to bind myself to it by reliving pieces of my earlier life until I couldn't distinguish reality from those phantoms. A sense of claustrophobia swelled within me and my heartbeat fluttered. My eyes darted around, half expecting the shadows beneath the rafters to shift or form an outline. I made a decision: if it wanted a companion, I would deny it, that I packed a bag, though my hands trembled so violently that it was almost impossible to zip it shut. The plan was simple: gather enough courage to walk away, to abandon whatever awaited me here. That evening, I felt the house pulsate with a strange energy, as if it sensed my intent. The lights dimmed abruptly, flaring back to life in short, aggressive bursts. My phone vibrated nonstop with no notifications. The radio switched on by itself, emitting a low hiss that modulated into a faint mocking tune. As I headed for the front door, the entire house fell silent. Too silent. No hum, no static, no creaking floors. The sudden absence of sound hammered at my eardrums. My throat went dry and a wave of goosebumps traveled the length of my arms. I froze at the threshold, almost dizzy with apprehension. My instincts screamed that I was being watched from every side, an omnipresent gaze drilling into my back. The silence stretched taut until it snapped in a violent burst of static. My phone shrieked with feedback, and the overhead lights flickered so rapidly that the hallway appeared like a stuttering film reel. Shadows elongated, contorted, and then snapped back with each surge of light. It felt like the house's final attempt to hold me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hardly keep my feet steady, but I refused to stop. I twisted the door knob and pulled, stepping out into the night air that felt surprisingly warm and vibrant compared to the tomb-like atmosphere inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the intense flickering behind me ceased. When I turned to look, the hallway light glowed steadily as if nothing had happened. Outside, my skin still prickled with residual fear, and my legs wobbled, nearly giving out beneath me. But I felt a suffocating weight lift from my chest the instant I closed the door. My mind reeled, drifting between relief and lingering terror. The quiet of the exterior world seemed jarring, almost unreal. For a few seconds, I couldn't trust my own senses. My pulse was hammering, and the cool breeze on my sweat-soaked skin made me shiver. I didn't stay to question whether the presence would follow. I simply got into my car and drove away, unable to stop checking the rear-view mirror. Even miles down the road, my heart still pounded in my ears. Every cell phone notification triggered a fresh spike of adrenaline, as though the entity might find me through digital signals. The diary now sits sealed in a plastic bag, locked away in a storage unit. I can't bear to read it again or destroy it. Part of me fears that doing either would open a channel back to that house. Late at night, when I'm half asleep, I sometimes hear faint static, or I dream of flickering lights and a lullaby echoing in the distance. I snap awake soaked in cold sweat, throat clenched, the taste of dread lingering on my tongue. Even in my new place, shadows sometimes seem to move in the corner of my eye. The memory of that presence feels burned into my consciousness, and my senses remain on high alert, waiting for the next glitch in a device or a ghostly tune from the radio. No matter where I go, a nagging question tugs at the edges of my mind. Is it truly behind me, or is it only a matter of time before it finds another way in? I tell myself it's over, that I've escaped whatever ancient force dwells in those walls. Yet every so often, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still part of its game. Like it's testing the limits of distance and time, waiting for an opening to reclaim what it believes belongs to it. When the night grows quiet and the electronic hum of modern devices becomes too loud, I wonder if I'm still hearing the house's distant call, and I can't help but feel that one day a single phone buzz might be all it takes for it to speak to me again, whispering my memories back to me, calling me home. Story 8. I first spotted the telephone in a dusty antique shop on the outskirts of town, bathed in the flickering haze of dying fluorescent lights. The moment I laid eyes on its tarnished brass and worn rotary dial, a strange chill prickled along my forearms. It looked like an ordinary vintage piece, cracked enamel, the faint smell of old varnish clinging to its body. But something in the air felt wrong. I remember trying to shake off the unsettling sensation, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Little did I know that my life would soon spiral into a nightmare of static-laced whispers, impossible apparitions, and the unrelenting certainty that I was never alone again. My name is Edward, and I consider myself a modest collector of unusual objects from decades past. There is a peculiar thrill in rummaging through junk stores and estate sales, searching for relics imbued with history. The old phone seemed like a perfect addition. I placed it on a shelf in my study, right next to an antique radio and a glass case of pocket watches. That night I went to bed feeling pleased with my find. Yet beneath my excitement, unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. The first unusual incident occurred early the next morning. I woke to a buzzing in my ears and almost imperceptible hum. Initially, I thought it was the overhead fan or a draft through the window. When I ventured into my study, though, the hum intensified. It crackled around me almost like an old radio struggling to catch a frequency. I could feel a faint static charge prickling the hair on my arms. There on the shelf, the phone seemed just as it had the day before, silent, motionless, its rotary dial pointing to nowhere. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the faint static was coming directly from it. I examined the phone's wires, expecting to find them frayed or poorly connected, but something was off. The phone wasn't. Plugged into anything, I let that realization sit in the pit of my stomach. The phone was completely disconnected from any power source, yet I could swear it was transmitting a faint, ghostly static. My heart began to pound so hard it felt as though it might crack my ribs. My breath turned shallow. I told myself it was an overreaction. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was some leftover energy from a battery or circuit. I didn't understand. I placed the phone in a box, thinking that distancing myself from it would calm my nerves. But that night, as I lay in bed with the lights off, I heard the faintest ring echo through the house. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The ring was dull, muffled, as if traveling through thick walls or across a great distance. My pulse raced and a cold sweat soaked my collar. I crept down the hall, each step feeling heavier with dread. When I reached the study, I stood there in the darkness, not daring to flick on the light. The phone rang again, sharper this time. The shrillness punctured the silence, rattling my composure. Even though logic told me it was impossible, I felt my legs quiver with an inexplicable mixture of terror and fascination. With trembling fingers, I answered the phone. I expected nothing but dead air. Instead, I heard the crackle of static hiss across the line, followed by a voice so distant it was barely more than a whisper. I strained to make out words, but the distortion was intense. I could only catch fragments, references to a street corner that no longer existed, or the name of a long-defunct local newspaper. The conversation was disorienting, like hearing one side of an old broadcast. Once more, I tried rationalizing. Maybe some stray signal was crossing wires. Maybe the phone was picking up transmissions from an old radio tower. Yet the voice on the other end was warm, intimate, and undeniably human. As abruptly as it had begun, the call ended in an explosion of static that made me drop the receiver in alarm. In the following days, my anxiety built. I felt uneasy in my own home, as though the phone's presence radiated a subtle menace. When I tried to sleep, I found myself tossing and turning, haunted by the memory of that voice. Vague images taunted me, a style of clothing decades out of date. A living room with a black and white television flickering. The very air around me felt charged with electricity. The phone sat on its shelf, silent and inert, yet I couldn't stop glancing at it. My heart pounded whenever I imagined it ringing again. The fear took on a visceral quality, making my mouth dry and leaving my hands clammy. Then the phone rang in broad daylight. Even though I'd removed the connection cable entirely, my pulse hammered in my ears as I answered it. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer. It spoke about events from 40 or 50 years ago as if they were happening in the present. There was a slight delay, and I realized with horrifying clarity that I was not simply listening to a stray broadcast. The voice was reacting to me. It seemed to be able to sense when I inhaled sharply or when my voice trembled. At one point, it asked in words I will only paraphrase if I had any newspapers from that day's date. And it mentioned wanting to know about the state of the city. Now my stomach churned with dread. How could a voice from the past ask me questions about the present over the next week? Objects began to appear in my house, bizarre items that had no place in my modern reality. I found a vintage matchbook advertising a theater that closed decades ago, and it lay open on my kitchen table. On another occasion, I discovered an ashtray in my bedroom, reeking of stale tobacco from a brand that hasn't been sold for years. Each time I confronted these impossible artifacts, I felt my throat tighten and my skin break out in a clammy sweat. My sense of normality shattered further when I discovered an ancient newspaper clipping pinned to my front door mentioning an event from the past that aligned too closely with details the voice had shared. My nights devolved into a blur of restless half-sleep tormented by nightmares. In these dreams, I was in a hallway lined with peonieces, each one ringing in a discordant symphony. Whenever I lifted a receiver, the world around me flickered like I was crossing into another time. The hallways felt endless, and something heavy pressed down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. Normally, I would often wake up gasping, my heart pounding erratically and the sheets soaked in sweat. I tried to confide in a friend, though I spoke mostly in vague terms, too embarrassed to share every detail. He suggested that stress might be affecting my perception. Perhaps I was leaving objects around without remembering. He told me not to panic, that it was all probably just in my head. I nodded along, but deep down I knew there was something truly unnatural about the phone and the calls. I could feel it each time I touched its cold metal frame. A static charge jumped between my fingers and the phone as if it were alive and hungry for connection. Soon the phone calls began coming at unpredictable intervals. Sometimes I would be washing dishes or trimming a plant and I'd hear that spine-tingling ring. My body would tense, breath catching in my throat, a wave of goosebumps rolling across my skin. Answering these calls became torturous, but ignoring them felt even worse. The voice, gradually losing its muffled quality, started demanding more information about my life, asking for proof of the modern era. Each time I tried to resist, my surroundings would flicker at the edges of my vision. Walls warping floors, shifting as if reality itself was tearing open around me. In those moments, a pure animalistic terror coursed through me. My chest felt constricted, my heart battered my ribs, and sweat trickled down my temples. I began to suspect that my phone was forging a rift in time, bridging the present to a long-gone era. With each call, the connection grew stronger. My perception of the city changed. Streets seemed to revert to older layouts. Certain buildings appeared as hollow shells of themselves. I'd pass by a corner store and swear I saw a vintage sign over the entrance, only for it to vanish when I whipped my head around for a second glance. The voice's relentless questions hinted that whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted access to my time. One night, I remember hearing the voice mention in essence that it was almost ready for the final step. That phrase sent a surge of dread that throbbed in my skull for hours. Convinced I had to rid myself of this cursed artifact, I decided to destroy the phone. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I carried it into my garage. By the time I placed it on my workbench, my entire body was shaking. I grabbed a hammer, took a deep breath, and swung down with all my might. The phone remained intact. A jolt like a static discharge shot up my arm, knocking me backward. A wave of dizziness nearly caused me to faint. I could only gape at the phone as it sat there unmarked. It seemed to hum, mocking my efforts. My pulse roared in my ears. I felt powerless against the eerie force that clung to the phone. That night, the phone rang more persistently than ever. When I answered, the voice felt like it was in the same room, its tone electric with excitement. I heard it referred to crossing a threshold bridging the gap fully. At that point, the room around me seemed to ripple as though I was caught in a heat wave. The walls flickered between my modern furnishings and an older decor, a battered sofa, a black and white TV, the distinctive odor of moldy books. My throat was parched and I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. The phone began to heat in my hand, searing my palm until I felt tears brimming in my eyes. I set the receiver down in panic, my breath coming in shallow gulps. As the distortion intensified, I stumbled outside for Earhart pounding like a drum. The phone continued to ring from inside the house, an unholy screech that made my skin crawl. I felt sure that if I didn't stop this connection soon, I'd be dragged into another time or lose my grip on reality entirely. Steeling myself, I rushed back in, ignoring the dizziness and the flickering illusions. My own reflection in the hallway mirror looked gaunt. Eyes wide with desperation, I forced myself into the study, yanked open the window, and seized the phone in both hands. With every ounce of strength, I hurled it into the night. It landed on the grass with a dull thud, the bell inside emitting a strangled clang. The ringing stopped abruptly. A deafening silence followed, broken only by my ragged breathing. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought I might black out. Eventually, I sank to the floor, drenched in sweat pulse, thudding painfully. An overwhelming sense of relief mingled with residual terror. I spent the night curled up in a chair, lights on eyes fixed on the empty spot where the phone had once sat. My chest felt tight, but slowly my breathing steadied. In the morning, I walked outside to check if the phone was still there. The yard was empty, no sign of metal shards or broken casing, no dent in the grass. At first, the relief nearly brought me to tears. Maybe the phone was gone for good. Maybe the connection was severed. I allowed myself a small flicker of hope. I returned inside, took a long shower, and felt my mind beginning to settle. The tension in my muscles started to loosen. Then as I stepped into my study, I froze. Resting on my desk as though it had never moved was the phone. Its brass glinted with a malevolent sheen, and the rotary dial was pointed to the exact time I had last answered it. A thick wave of nausea rolled over me. My heart pounded against my ribs and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. I realized that I was indeed dealing with something outside the realm of reason, something that could ignore distance and destruction, something that would remain as long as it willed. My entire body trembled with a potent mixture of rage, fear, and resignation. The house felt impossibly still, the air heavy with a charged silence. In that moment, I understood that I could not simply discard or break the phone. It had chosen me. It was a door, one that I had inadvertently opened, and now it refused to let me close it. The voice from the other side had grown too strong. The presence lurking in the static had already shaped my reality, planting objects from the past like seeds in my present, warping my home into a gateway. Paranoia coursed through my veins, intensifying my every heartbeat. My mouth went dry. A prickling sensation crept across my scalp, and I half expected the phone to ring on its own. Yet it remained silent as I stood there grappling with the revelation that it no longer needed to ring to command my attention. It was an active force in my life, bridging two eras in ways I still couldn't fully comprehend. I realized then that I had two choices: flee my house and abandon everything, or face the phone and accept that my existence was inexorably entwined with something not meant for human understanding. I refused to live in perpetual terror. So I steadied my trembling hands, stared at the phone, and vowed not to let it dominate me. The tension in my chest raged on, but I inhaled until my lungs ached. Some primal part of me suspected that if I let my fear take hold completely, I would never return to sanity. My vision blurred at the edges as I approached the phone. The atmosphere in the study felt oppressive, tinged with ozone and an antique odor. Despite the suffocating pressure, I picked up the receiver, slowly braced for static or the voice's cold demands, but the line was silent, no hum, no whisper. That silence was more unnerving than any call. I had the sense it was waiting. Time wavered in the corner of my eye. I glimpsed shadows of old furniture layering over my modern desk. I swallowed hard and gently placed the receiver back, heart slamming against my ribcage. My palms were clammy and my breathing ragged, yet I was still there in my study, rooted to the spot. Even now, I live in a state of watchful anxiety. Every time the phone catches the corner of my eye, my pulse spikes. I've tried moving it to closets, attics, even the basement, but it somehow returns to my study. Always in that same place on the desk. I have not heard a ring for days, but the hush itself weighs on me like a threat. I sense that the boundary between past and present remains open, an unholy wound that refuses to heal. Late at night, I sometimes think I hear faint footsteps in the hall. Soft, measured pacing, as though someone from another time is already here waiting for me to slip up. The dread never leaves me and sleep offers little respite. In my nightmares, the phone's ring echoes endlessly, pulling me deeper into corridors of flickering lights and ghostly silhouettes. I'm certain the story isn't finished, and that knowledge gnaws at my mind every waking hour. Because one truth remains indisputable: once a door is opened, it can never truly be closed again. Story 9. The instant I first set foot in my new apartment, a wave of unease rippled through me. It was as though the very air pressed against my skin, whispering that something wasn't quite right. The hall lights flickered and a damp, stale odor grazed my nostrils as if walls had been left to rot behind layers of paint. This initial shiver of apprehension burrowed into my bones, refusing to let me settle comfortably. I dismissed it at the time, telling myself that I was overreacting to normal apartment quirks, a bit of old wiring, maybe poor ventilation. But I was wrong. I realize now that this place was never just an ordinary home. It was a doorway into a reality I wish I had never discovered. I'm a professor of comparative literature, a man who has spent countless nights reading obscure texts and deciphering cryptic metaphors. I'm used to the strange details that hide in the margins of old manuscripts, peculiar footnotes, scribbled warnings, and faded ink. But I never expected my academic fascination with hidden meanings to bleed into my personal life. And yet that is precisely what happened. My new apartment, located in a once grand building not far from the university, seemed innocent enough on the surface. Polished hardwood floors greeted me in the foyer, and a wide corridor led to a spacious living room with tall windows. At first glance, everything seemed normal, if a bit aged. That first week, I was so preoccupied with the start of the semester that I barely noticed the oddities. A subdued feeling of being watched persisted whenever I returned from campus, but I dismissed it as stress-induced paranoia. My days were busy lecturing bright-eyed undergraduates, holding office hours, and poring over dusty books for my own research. By the time I got home, I was usually too exhausted to focus on anything beyond dinner and a few more pages of reading before bed. Still, every now and then, I'd pause in the middle of the living room, hearing soft murmurs behind a wall or catching a glimpse of movement in a corner I thought was empty. Each time, the hairs on my arms would rise and a heavy tightness filled my chest. The turning point arrived during my second weekend in the apartment. It was a quiet Saturday night, and I had decided to treat myself to a long bath after a grueling week of grading papers. While resting in the water, I closed my eyes. The gentle drip of the faucet lulled me into a kind of half-conscious daze. Then a sudden creak from the hallway snapped me back. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment I was certain someone was walking right outside the bathroom door. My breaths turned shallow as I listened carefully. Another creak, and I felt goosebumps spread along my damp skin. With trembling hands, I dried myself and put on a robe, flinging the door open. Nobody was there. The corridor stood empty and silent. Yet somehow it didn't feel empty. It felt as though the air itself bristled with an unwelcome presence. In the following days, subtle distortions became frequent. I'd catch sight of wallpaper that wasn't there before, an ornate floral pattern in muted gold and green peeling at the edges. It would appear in fleeting glimpses. One blink it was there. The next blink replaced by the apartment's bland off-white walls. Sometimes it was the furniture. I'd see a faint outline of a Victorian-style settee by the window, but when I turned around fully, it vanished, leaving only my modern couch. These illusions, or whatever they were, left me feeling unsteady. My palms would sweat and my heart would pound each time. The sense of something profoundly wrong soared higher with every new sighting. It wasn't merely visual distortions either. I started hearing muffled voices in the night, hushed conversations as though people were gathered in my living room, discussing topics I couldn't quite make out. Once, when the voices were particularly audible, I summoned the courage to press my ear to the door. My heart hammered, stomach twisting in anxious knots. A man's voice seemed to state something about preparing for the arrival. That single phrase made my skin go clammy. Yet when I finally swung open the door, the room was dark and empty, no sign of any visitors. During the day, I tried to rationalize it all. Perhaps the building had poor insulation, I told myself. Maybe I was overhearing neighbors from an adjacent unit. The more I told myself these stories, the less they helped. A creeping suspicion formed. I was hearing fragments of a different time. By the third week, my suspicions grew into something more like dread. My possessions started to change, sometimes right in front of me. I'd place my phone on the kitchen counter, turn away for a second, and turn back to find an old-fashioned rotary phone in its place. I'd blink rapidly, convinced it was a trick of the light, only to see it flicker between modern and antique, eventually settling back into my smartphone. The effect was devastating to my sense of normalcy. Adrenaline would flood my veins, my breath hitching until it felt like my lungs were on fire. I tried to share these experiences with a colleague at the university, though indirectly to save myself from sounding completely deranged. I mentioned old building anomalies, illusions, and the possibility of optical illusions caused by stress. In return, he offered some half-hearted reassurance that transitions to new living spaces can be stressful, that my mind might be overworked. He suggested I take a break from academic obligations. I nodded politely, but inside I was spiraling. Could stress alone conjure wallpaper and furniture from decades past? Could fatigue rearrange my apartment's layout, guiding me into corridors that shouldn't exist? Yes, corridors that shouldn't exist. I'll never forget the morning it happened. I was running late for a lecture, a thick stack of graded papers tucked under my arm, and I needed to grab my satchel from the bedroom. I hurried through the hallway only to find myself in a completely unfamiliar part of the apartment. A narrow, claustrophobic space lit by a single dusty bulb. The walls were lined with aged wallpaper, the same pattern I had glimpsed sporadically before. My pulse throbbed so loudly in my ears that I had to force myself to stay calm. Step by step, I moved forward, the squeak of the floorboards matching my ragged breathing. My arms trembled and a sheen of cold sweat dripped from my temples. Then just like that, the corridor opened into a cramped parlor filled with antiquated furniture, a small lamp with a fringed shade, a sewing table, and a high-backed chair upholstered in worn velvet. It smelled of stale perfume and dust. For a split second, I saw people dressed in early 20th century clothing going about their day as though I didn't exist. A man with a neatly trimmed mustache flipped through a newspaper while a woman in a long dress fussed with a lamp. My heart raced out of control, my breath coming in rapid bursts that left me dizzy. My body was screaming to turn and run, but a morbid curiosity rooted me in place. I tried to. Movement in a corner I thought was empty. Each time the hairs on my arms would rise and a heavy tightness filled my chest. The turning point arrived during my second weekend in the apartment. It was a quiet Saturday night, and I had decided to treat myself to a long bath after a grueling week of grading papers. While resting in the water, I closed my eyes. The gentle drip of the faucet lulled me into a kind of half-conscious daze. Then a sudden creak from the hallway snapped me back. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment I was certain someone was walking right outside the bathroom door. My breaths turned shallow as I listened carefully. Another creak, and I felt goosebumps spread along my damp skin. With trembling hands, I dried myself and put on a robe, flinging the door open. Nobody was there. The corridor stood empty and silent. Yet somehow it didn't feel empty. It felt as though the air itself bristled with an unwelcome presence. In the following days, subtle distortions became frequent. I'd catch sight of wallpaper that wasn't there before, an ornate floral pattern in muted gold and green peeling at the edges. It would appear in fleeting glimpses. One blink it was there. The next blink replaced by the apartment's bland off-white walls. Sometimes it was the furniture. I'd see a faint outline of a Victorian-style settee by the window, but when I turned around fully, it vanished, leaving only my modern couch. These illusions, or whatever they were, left me feeling unsteady. My palms would sweat and my heart would pound each time. The sense of something profoundly wrong soared higher with every new sighting. It wasn't merely visual distortions either. I started hearing muffled voices in the night, hushed conversations as though people were gathered in my living room, discussing topics I couldn't quite make out. Once, when the voices were particularly audible, I summoned the courage to press my ear to the door. My heart hammered, stomach twisting in anxious knots. A man's voice seemed to state something about preparing for the arrival. That single phrase made my skin go clammy. Yet when I finally swung open the door, the room was dark and empty, no sign of any visitors. During the day, I tried to rationalize it all. Perhaps the building had poor insulation, I told myself. Maybe I was overhearing neighbors from an adjacent unit. The more I told myself these stories, the less they helped. A creeping suspicion formed. I was hearing fragments of a different time. By the third week, my suspicions grew into something more like dread. My possessions started to change, sometimes right in front of me. I'd place my phone on the kitchen counter, turn away for a second, and turn back to find an old-fashioned rotary phone in its place. I'd blink rapidly, convinced it was a trick of the light, only to see it flicker between modern and antique, eventually settling back into my smartphone. The effect was devastating to my sense of normalcy. Adrenaline would flood my veins, my breath hitching until it felt like my lungs were on fire. I tried to share these experiences with a colleague at the university, though indirectly to save myself from sounding completely deranged. I mentioned old building anomalies, illusions, and the possibility of optical illusions caused by stress. In return, he offered some half-hearted reassurance that transitions to new living spaces can be stressful, that my mind might be overworked. He suggested I take a break from academic obligations. I nodded politely, but inside I was spiraling. Could stress alone, conjure wallpaper and furniture from decades past? Could fatigue rearrange my apartment's layout, guiding me into corridors that shouldn't exist? Yes, corridors that shouldn't exist. I'll never forget the morning it happened. I was running late for a lecture, a thick stack of graded papers tucked under my arm, and I needed to grab my satchel from the bedroom. I hurried through the hallway only to find myself in a completely unfamiliar part of the apartment. A narrow, claustrophobic space lit by a single dusty bulb. The walls were lined with aged wallpaper, the same pattern I had glimpsed sporadically before. My pulse throbbed so loudly in my ears that I had to force myself to stay calm. Step by step, I moved forward, the squeak of the floorboards matching my ragged breathing. My arms trembled and a sheen of cold sweat dripped from my temples. Then just like that, the corridor opened into a cramped parlor filled with antiquated furniture, a small lamp with a fringed shade, a sewing table, and a high-backed chair upholstered in worn velvet. It smelled of stale perfume and dust. For a split second, I saw people dressed in early 20th century clothing going about their day as though I didn't exist. A man with a neatly trimmed mustache flipped through a newspaper while a woman in a long dress fussed with a lamp. My heart raced out of control, my breath coming in rapid bursts that left me dizzy. My body was screaming to turn and run, but a morbid curiosity rooted me in place. I tried to speak, but found my voice caught in my throat. I attempted to call out to ask what was happening, but the words lodged behind my teeth. The man glanced in my direction momentarily, and for a fraction of a second I believed he saw me. yet his eyes skimmed past as if I were invisible. My mouth went dry and my palms turned clammy. Then, like a switch, flipping the parlor blinked out of existence, replaced by my modern hallway. I nearly collapsed from the rush of terror and confusion. By the time I gathered myself, I realized I was late for class. My entire body shook. My lips were chapped from panting and my shirt clung to my skin. I somehow managed to drive to the university, though I have no recollection of the journey. Throughout the lecture, I was distracted, stumbling over words as students stared at me curiously. Sweat formed at my temple and my breathing never fully stabilized. I ended the class early, muttering an excuse about feeling unwell. That night, I chose to stay in a hotel, too frightened to sleep in the apartment. Of course, that didn't solve anything. My mind churned with fear, replaying that impossible corridor and the indifferent man who seemed to look right through me. My heart felt caged by a sense of encroaching madness. If I told anyone else about these visions, I risked damaging my reputation. A tenure professor losing grip on reality. The notion paralyzed me with anxiety. Eventually, I realized I couldn't hide from it forever. I returned to the apartment late the following day. My plan was to gather some clothes and important papers and keep searching for somewhere else to live, even if breaking the lease would be an expensive mess. But the universe had other plans. Upon entering the front door, I felt the atmosphere pressing down on me more intensely than ever. A tangible heaviness blanketed the place, making it difficult to breathe. Every step along the hallway felt like wading through thick mud, my legs trembling beneath me. I flicked the lights on, but they offered no comfort. The bulbs cast a sickly yellow glow, the same color of light I had seen in that old parlor. My first indication that the apartment was fluctuating again came when I stepped into the living room. The entire space had transformed. Gone were my contemporary sofa and book-lined shelves. In their place stood worn armchairs with spindly legs, a low mahogany table, and a tall grandfather clock ticking ominously. My pulse soared, beating so violently I could feel my neck throb. Sweat trickled down my spine as I scanned the room. An ancient smell like old paper and musty fabric took hold of me. The overhead fixture flickered, providing just enough illumination to make out shapes in the gloom. I had no idea whether I was hallucinating or if this was the reality. Now I walked gingerly, flinching at every subtle creak. Then from one dark corner I sensed movement. My stomach clenched as I spotted a silhouette. Someone standing near the clock. Without direct words, I experienced a sudden, overwhelming conviction that this figure was aware of my presence. My breathing turned ragged, my fingers tingled with pins and needles, and a deep chill curled in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to speak, but my throat seemed to close. Finally, I croaked a single word, my voice shaking. "Hello." The figure's outline twisted slightly as though listening. I heard a quiet rustle, followed by a near silent step. My entire body locked up. It felt like an eternity before I willed myself to move. I took a single step back, almost stumbling over my own feet. An instant later, the lights blinked out in the pitch-black silence. My heart hammered so loudly it seemed to echo. My inhalations became rapid gulps of air and my skin went ice cold. Each second stretched into infinity. Then the lights flickered back on, revealing my own living room furniture in its usual arrangement. The figure was gone. A wave of nausea gripped me and I sprinted to the bathroom, doubling over as I tried to steady my nerves. My limbs trembled violently. My lungs couldn't seem to draw enough oxygen and tears brimmed in my eyes. Not from sadness, but from raw, unfiltered terror. Over the next few days, the apartment seemed to lurch between two realities. More often, I would wake up in my bed to find the room's wallpaper changed and a vintage vanity table instead of my simple wooden desk. If I blinked enough times, it gradually morphed back into my modern decor, leaving me with a throbbing headache and a terrible sense that I was coming unhinged. The voices, too, grew louder, always in hushed, urgent tones. Sometimes they discussed household matters. Other times they muttered ominous phrases about guests or strange sightings. They never addressed me directly, but their intangible presence gnawed at my sanity. Desperate, I combed through local archives searching for any mention of what my building used to be. I learned it had once been a private residence for a family in the early 1900s. The available records were sparse, but I found references to renovations done multiple times over the decades. None of the files mentioned anything specifically supernatural, no scandal or tragedy. Yet I still felt that the past had not fully relinquished its hold on these walls. Each time the environment shifted, my fight or flight response went haywire. My pulse would skyrocket. My breathing would turn to ragged gasps, and an oppressive sense of being cornered weighed on me. Sometimes I'd notice changes in my own possessions that never changed back, like a fountain pen that replaced my modern ballpoint or a dusty ledger where my brand new notebook had been. It was as if the apartment or whatever force controlled it was slowly erasing my present. The sleepless nights accumulated. I'd hear the faint sound of clocks ticking in rooms I didn't own, or the soft ring of an antique telephone somewhere in the hallway. Though no phone was physically there, my entire being felt under siege. Whenever I tried to muster the courage to leave for good, the apartment would lure me into a fresh spectacle, momentarily paralyzing me with confusion and dread. One evening, after an exhausting day of lectures and research, I finally decided I'd had enough. Heart-pounding but resolute, I packed a small suitcase with essential documents, a couple of changes of clothes, and my laptop. This time, I wasn't just leaving for the night, I was leaving for good. As I zipped my suitcase shut, I felt an inexplicable shift in the air. My breath came in jittery spurts, my palms slick with sweat. A low hum vibrated through the walls, the floor, even the doorknobs. I braced myself forcibly, steadying my trembling legs, and marched toward the front door. Before I could reach the door, it swung open on its own with an agonizing creak. The corridor outside had transformed into that suffocating passage from before, lit by the same single dusty bulb wallpaper curling at the edges. My heart drummed against my ribs so fiercely I thought I might faint. But determination rose in my chest. I would not let this place keep me trapped. Mustering courage, I stepped forward. The corridor seemed endless, snaking ahead in a path that shouldn't logically fit inside my building. I walked faster, ignoring the panic scorching my lungs. My suitcase felt heavier with every step, my entire body slick with cold perspiration. Then, as if mocking my desperation, the corridor opened into that same old-fashioned parlor. The figures were there again, their backs turned. The woman adjusted the fringe on the lamp. The man fiddled with his newspaper. My heart soared to a frantic beat, my muscles tensing in a full-body tremor. Yet I walked on, refusing to let the fear stop me. My vision blurred with tears of anxiety as I brushed past them. They seemed intangible, like shadows from a film reel playing on a loop. I expected them to stop me or react in some horrifying way, but they didn't. They remained locked in their routine, ignoring my existence entirely. On the other side of the parlor, I spotted a door half concealed by heavy drapes. My breath felt scorching hot in my throat, my mouth as dry as sandpaper. But I forced myself forward, each footstep landing with a quiver. I pushed the door open. Beyond it lay the real corridor, my building's modern hallway. Relief surged through me, and I practically stumbled into the light. Behind me, the parlor vanished the moment I stepped through, leaving only the battered hallway I knew. The oppressive heaviness lifted, if only slightly. I didn't waste another second. Suitcase in hand, heart hammering, I made for the stairs and out of the building. My adrenaline spiked so sharply that my legs felt like jelly. Outside, the night air was crisp, and I drank it in gasping. Even the city's usual den of traffic and distant sirens comforted me with its familiarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was back in a world that made sense. I found a temporary sublet that same night. I never set foot in that apartment again. I did, however, return once during the daytime, accompanied by a building manager to finalize my early lease termination. I hardly spoke, preferring to let him drone on about fees and paperwork and indirect references. He gave me a stern look now and then, probably suspecting I was a troublemaker. but none of that mattered. All I cared about was never again sinking into those overlapping realities. I wish I could say that I've recovered fully, but in truth, late at night, I still feel that lingering presence. I'll glance around whatever room I'm in, half expecting a flicker of ancient wallpaper or the echo of voices from another century. My pulse spikes and the memory of that suffocating corridor crushes my chest. Sometimes the corners of my vision still threaten to change, and I find myself blinking, wildly afraid of what I might see if I let my guard down. Every draft of air brushing my neck makes me wonder if something has followed me. I even catch myself checking my belongings for transformations, double-checking that my phone is still a phone, that my watch hasn't morphed into some antique time. Peace. Deep down, I suspect I will never fully escape the apartment's hold. Perhaps by stepping through those corridors, I crossed a threshold meant to remain sealed. The thought plagues me, haunting my nights and creeping into my daytime reflections. My heart rate quickens, just remembering how the apartment shimmered between two eras, how it felt like reality itself was unraveling under my feet. But I remind myself that I left at least physically. I parted those suffocating shadows behind me. Even now as I write these words, the mere recollection triggers a prickling sensation across my skin. My breath catches in my throat when I recall that final moment inside the parlor, brushing against the intangible figures who neither acknowledged nor halted me. There were no cries, no curses, just indifference. And perhaps that more than anything is what continues to disturb me. I was an intruder in their realm, and they simply did not care. It's a cold indifference that gnaws at the edges of my sanity, reminding me that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that remain just out of reach, looming in the periphery of an impossible hallway, waiting for us to turn back and slip through the veil once more. Story 10. I still remember the first night it happened, even though every fiber of my being wishes I could forget. The moonlight spilled through the blinds in pale stripes across the living room floor, and a deep hush clung to the walls like a living presence. I'd always considered myself someone who understood the intricacies of the human mind. I am, after all, a psychologist. But as the hush thickened into something tangible pressing into my ears, something unsettled me to my core. I sensed that I was not alone, though I was certain I hadn't let anyone into my home. The darkness felt charged, as if it were breathing alongside me, and my heartbeat hammered so forcefully that my vision blurred. That night was only the beginning, the first step into a darkness far deeper than I ever thought I'd encounter. I'd moved into this small Midwestern town some months before, hoping for a peaceful environment after years of working in a bustling city practice. My new home was a modest but comfortable house situated near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The neighbors initially seemed friendly, greeting me with cautious smiles. It was the kind of place people retired to a slice of serenity away from urban chaos. I found the tranquility comforting until the dreams started. They were oddly specific from the start. I'd find myself standing in the middle of an underground chamber, dimly lit by weak bulbs swinging overhead. A musty smell weighed down the air. Every time I heard the same voice, low and authoritative, resonating through the darkness, I couldn't see the speaker, but the words felt like an order. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my pulse thudding in my ears. At first, I wrote it off as stress from the move. Then I began noticing small details. The muscles in my arms felt sore, as if I had been lifting something heavy while I slept. Dirt kept appearing under my fingernails. I examined my bed and the floors, trying to find an explanation, but there was no soil anywhere inside the house that matched the grit I found on my hands. It made no sense. It left me jittery, anxious, second-guessing my own routines. One morning I felt compelled to check the perimeter of my house, though I couldn't rationalize why. My chest felt tight with a strange foreboding I'd never experienced before. Near the foundation, I discovered uneven patches of upturned earth. The realization that I might have done this in my sleep hit me like a punch to the stomach. The soil was fresh marked with the impression of footprints, and it led to a vent opening on the side of the house. My heart throbbed, my breathing turned shallow, and a film of sweat coated the back of my neck. I told myself I'd check with my neighbors. Maybe they had seen something, or maybe they'd been dealing with similar issues. But who would believe me that afternoon I knocked on the door of the couple who lived next door. They looked exhausted with dark circles under their eyes and expressions that mirrored my own confusion. They mentioned in halting phrases and with uneasy glances that they'd been suffering from strange dreams as well. They hadn't wanted to talk about it, but once I brought it up, they seemed almost relieved to share. They thought I might be able to help them understand the nightmares because of my training. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden clarity. Instead, they described the same subterranean room, the same oppressive voice issuing commands. The husband's voice shook when he recounted waking up in the dead of night, standing outside by the bushes with a shovel in hand. His wife said she'd found dusty footprints in their hallway. Both of them were as bewildered and terrified as I was. Over the next few days, I learned mostly through indirect, uncomfortable conversations around the neighborhood that more residents were experiencing the same phenomena. Each time someone recounted these episodes, I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. Some admitted to discovering crusts of dirt beneath their fingernails or tools left lying near the crawl spaces under their homes. A heavy, suffocating tension took root in the community, as if we were collectively drifting into an unfamiliar mental space. My professional instincts kicked in. I tried to analyze these dreams from a psychological standpoint, but logic failed me whenever I recalled that voice and the painful clarity of those underground visions. I decided to research the area's history. Thinking maybe I'd uncover a rational explanation, I started by scouring old newspaper archives in the local library. The building itself had an unsettling aura, with dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead and the faint smell of stale paper in the air. My skin prickled as I flipped through pages that recounted the life of an eccentric millionaire who had owned much of the land in this part of town nearly a century ago. He was known for bankrolling strange experiments, apparently fascinated by the human mind's susceptibility to suggestion. Rumor had it that he held gatherings in a hidden laboratory on the outskirts of the property. Those old clippings suggested he vanished from public life under suspicious circumstances. Yet no official record explained why or how he had disappeared. The more I read, the more agitated I became. My hands trembled when I handled the archival documents, and I wiped sweat from my forehead. As if feverish, I felt eyes on me, as though the quiet librarian behind the desk might be looking my way too often. Every shuffle of a page turned into a jolt. Each subtle creak of the old building made my pulse jump. It wasn't purely paranoia. I sensed something intangible pressing in on me, draining my courage. My breath came faster. My mouth ran dry, and the tension in my chest grew relentless. Eventually, I discovered references to a supposed mind control apparatus that the millionaire had funded, complete with cryptic descriptions of how it might extend beyond his lifetime. The local author who wrote these articles never provided full details, but the seed had been planted in my mind. Somehow, this man's experiments were continuing, and we were unwitting participants. I returned home that evening uneasy and exhausted. As I stepped through my front door, the living room silence loomed with oppressive weight. The single lamp I'd left on flickered, casting skittering shadows on the walls. With every flicker, my heart rattled in my ribcage. I placed the library documents on the coffee table and tried to steady my breathing. Then the pounding started, not from outside, but from deep within my house. Each hollow thud reverberated through the walls, resonating in my chest. A chilling wave crawled across my skin. I followed the sound until I reached the door leading to the basement. My shaking hand gripped the doorknob, and the wood felt ice cold against my damp palm. Slowly, I opened it. Descending into the basement felt like crossing into a different world. The light from upstairs barely reached the bottom of the steps. My heart hammered, my vision blurred at the edges from a potent blend of adrenaline and fear. With trembling fingers, I found the light switch. Dim, buzzing fluorescence revealed dusty shelves and old boxes. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but in the far corner near the boiler, the concrete floor was cracked. Fragments of concrete had been chipped away, and fresh dirt was strewn around it. The handle of a shovel stuck out from the debris as if someone had begun digging. An icy wave of panic threatened to buckle my knees. I realized I had no recollection of doing any of this. My entire body tensed, and a sense of unreality washed over me so intensely that I questioned whether I was dreaming again. I climbed back upstairs and bolted the basement door behind me, then called a close neighbor to discuss what I'd found. He told me in a strained, halting voice that he had discovered a similar pit underneath his home. We arranged to meet with a few other residents. No one wanted to admit it openly, but we felt controlled as though these shared dreams were more than just illusions. Someone brought up the eccentric millionaire's name, though they avoided looking at the rest of us when they said it as if speaking it aloud might summon him. I felt dread coil tighter around my lungs. Everyone seemed to sense an unseen presence pushing us towards some unknown objective. On the fourth night, I became keenly aware that I was no longer simply sleeping, I was being led. In the dream, I walked barefoot on cold stone, a faint hum surrounding me like a pulsating ring of static. My mouth was bone dry, my limbs heavy. My chest ached with a dire need to escape whatever was waiting in the darkness, but the voice would not allow it. When I snapped awake, heart battering my ribs, I found myself on my knees in the basement, covered in dust and sweat, with the shovel's handle gripped in my shaking hands. My entire body felt stiff as though I had been in that position for hours. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. In a desperate attempt to break this cycle, I gathered my neighbors for a meeting one afternoon. We spoke about ways to sever the hold these dreams had on us. Nobody claimed to have any definitive solution, but suggestions included everything from sleeping pills to round-the-clock watch groups. I proposed that we block access to our basement and keep each other accountable. We agreed to try, though we were terrified of falling asleep and losing control again. As a group, we strategized, lock the shovels away, seal off the crawl spaces. Do anything to prevent ourselves from carrying out these commands in the dead of night. But in the depths of our eyes, we all harbored the same raw terror. We could feel an outside will tugging at us like puppets on strings. Night came, and I set up makeshift barricades around my basement door. I even hung wind chimes in my hallway, hoping that if I started sleepwalking, the chimes would stir me awake. Sleep clung to me reluctantly, as though it too feared what lurked in the corners of my mind. At some point, I jolted upright, startled by a faint metallic tinkling. My pulse surged. Sweat prickled my forehead. The corridor was dark, illuminated only by a meager moonlight filtered through a single window. At the far end, I caught a glimpse of movement. My own silhouette reflected in a mirror, but it felt as if someone else were there. My body trembled so violently that I had to steady myself against the wall. The chimes had been brushed aside, but I couldn't recall having walked through them. Panicked and on the verge of hyperventilating, I rushed to the basement door. The barricade was intact. My relief was short-lived, though, because the voice still reverberated in my head, that low murmur instructing me to continue digging. Adrenaline spiked my pulse again, and I clutched the door knob, half expecting it to turn on its own. My nails bit into my palms. My vision wavered under flickering lamplight. The voice pounded in my skull until I felt tears well in my eyes from fear as much as frustration. Then, with a suddenness that made me gasp, the voice receded, leaving a hollow ring in my ears. The following morning, I sensed a collective shift in the neighborhood. People appeared more haggarded than ever, with trembling hands and disoriented gazes. Some had found newly excavated holes in their basements or under their porches, still damp from overnight digging. Others reported hearing that same disembodied whisper intruding on their half-formed dreams. The sense of impending doom thickened. Even the sunlight felt cold on my skin. I realized we had to confront the history behind this phenomenon. We located a hidden archival file hinting at an abandoned bunker on the outskirts of the old millionaire's estate. Under a bright but somehow bleak sky, a small group of us decided to investigate. My knees threatened to buckle the moment we stepped onto the overgrown property. A stagnant odor hung in the air, and the cause of distant crows echoed in my ears like mocking laughter. Thorny bushes scratched at our ankles as we trudged through tall grass. Eventually, we found a rusted hatch in the ground, half concealed by rotting planks and vines. Our hearts thundered in unison as we pried it open. The bunker's interior was cramped and suffocating. Ancient machinery lined the walls, coated with cobwebs and dust, so thick it felt like stepping into a mausoleum of technology. My pulse hammered relentlessly, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. In the dim glow of a single flashlight, we noticed strange contraptions reminiscent of early radio equipment. We also found shelves stacked with notebooks scrolled in a near unreadable script. The pages described techniques to project instructions into unsuspecting minds, harnessing dream states as conduits for control. My chest constricted and my vision swam with nausea. Each of us felt that same insidious presence pressing down as if the very walls were a sentinel for the old millionaire's twisted obsession. A wave of dizziness nearly drove me to my knees. My teeth chattered from a mixture of fear and the bunker's chilly dampness. With a trembling hand, I flicked through the notebooks until I found repeated references to unfinished experiments. The entries hinted that the millionaire had discovered a way to maintain his influence indefinitely, using the land's unique geological properties to radiate signals. Stumbling backward, I caught my reflection in a warped metal panel. My face looked ghostly pale, drenched in sweat with wide, haunted eyes. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Though we lacked a clear idea of how to stop it, we knew that this equipment was at the center of our nightmare, adrenaline pumping. We dismantled what little we could, ripping out tubes, smashing small components, dousing the entire area in salt water. We brought in jugs. I'm not sure we truly understood the science, but we were desperate. The act felt like fighting a specter. Sweat poured down my face as we worked frantically, and I gasped for air in the fetid bunker. Just as I removed the final set of wires from the main console, a sudden wave of vertigo slammed into me, and the voice resurged in my mind with more ferocity than ever. My vision blackened at the edges. A wave of terror nearly paralyzed me. Then just as quickly, the pressure lifted. The voice faded to an echo. Without another word, we scrambled out of that place, hearts racing. The late afternoon sun burned into our eyes, intensifying our pounding headaches. Back in our neighborhood, the strangling sense of oppression had lessened, replaced by an uneasy calm. The following nights weren't entirely peaceful. Most of us reported fragments of strange dreams, but the uncontrollable digging episodes ceased. My hands no longer ached in the mornings, and when I checked my basement floor, the dugout section remained untouched. Dirt no longer found its way under my fingernails. Yet even now, I can't shake the suspicion that the influence isn't gone, it's simply lying dormant. When I drift off to sleep, I sometimes catch faint whispers almost too low to register. My chest tightens whenever I imagine the labyrinthine passages that might still exist beneath this land. The historical records never mention just one bunker. There could be more. And if the original experiments were as advanced as those notebooks suggested, there's no telling what else was set into motion. I've decided to stay at least for the time being and keep a watchful eye. A psychologist's training can help explore the boundary between rational explanation and whatever lurks beyond rational thought. I still feel that creeping paranoia, that sense of being monitored. Sometimes under the faint moonlight, I hear the wind chimes ring in the hallway, even though there's no breeze. I jolt awake, chest heaving, a thin layer of cold sweat on my skin. I remind myself that I dismantled that equipment, that we severed the power lines fueling that old system. But the memory of that stern voice commanding me to kneel in that subterranean chamber remains vivid. My mouth runs dry whenever I think about it. My heart skipping a beat as if preparing for another onslaught. Though I haven't set foot in that bunker since I carry the unsettling knowledge that sometimes people don't truly leave this world, at least not completely. Their obsessions can linger, burrowing into the minds of those unlucky enough to share the same soil. My neighbors and I continue to meet, exchanging stories of strange dreams and fleeting shadows. Nobody has died or disappeared, but a haunted feeling persists. Our nights remain clouded by an uncomfortable uncertainty. We're free for now, but the presence that etched itself in our collective consciousness might awaken again. Every time I step into my basement, a chill crawls along my spine. I can almost smell the cold earth, feel the grit under my nails, and hear the muffled pounding of shovel against soil. My heart races and a hollow dread gnaws at me. For now, the nightmares have loosened their grip. Yet I can't fully rid myself of the feeling that somewhere beneath my feet, that old obsession still stirs, waiting to infiltrate my mind once more. It's a lingering, disquing truth that I must live with. An echo of a malevolent will that continues its twisted work beyond anything we can fully understand. And that realization seeping into my thoughts every time I drift into uneasy slumber is the purest form of horror I've ever experienced. Story 11. The night I first realized something was terribly wrong. I was sitting alone in my study, surrounded by the antiques that I had spent years collecting with obsessive devotion. The glow from a single desk lamp flickered against the darkened shelves, casting wavering shadows on the walls. The air felt stifling, as though the house itself were exhaling shallow, rasping breaths around me. Every so often, a distant creak echoed through the corridors, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle in response. The unease that had settled in my gut was sharper than usual, like a constant tug reminding me that something was off. At the center of it all was that cursed clock on the wall, its ancient face reflecting the pallid light, its brass pendulum slicing through the gloom. Each swing a rasp against my nerves. I should have trusted my initial reluctance. The moment I laid eyes on this peculiar timepiece at an estate sale, my instinct screamed for me to walk away. But I ignored that pang of warning. I was too intrigued by its intricate carvings and the small haunting portrait set into the wooden frame. It depicted a gaunt-faced man in archaic attire, his eyes following me no matter which angle I stood at. I remember the vendor describing him in hushed tones as an occultist, someone who had dabbled in forbidden practices. My heart thumped louder when I heard that, but I passed off my apprehension as simple superstition. Now, as I recount these events, I wish I had never brought that clock into my home. The feeling that it was always watching me proved impossible to shake. I have always been proud of my collection. A menagerie of vintage records, Victorian silverware, turn-of-the-century paintings and rare books I gathered from distant corners of the country. Each piece represented a story, a connection to a bygone era. My home became a patchwork museum, a labyrinth of relics arranged with an archivist's precision. Yet, since bringing in the clock, all the items I once adored lost their charm. My focus shifted entirely to the new acquisition, as if everything else dulled into the background. From the start, the clock's ticking felt unnervingly intimate. It reverberated through the house like a pulse and acoustic heartbeat that aligned disconcertingly with my own. I would notice my breath catching whenever the second hand paused momentarily, as if the air had grown too thick to inhale. Then the ticking would resume and I'd find myself exhaling in relief. At first, I tried to dismiss this sensation as an overactive imagination, but the connection only grew stronger until ignoring it became impossible. Within the first week, I discovered an unsettling pattern. When the clock lost time, when it ran a minute or two behind, I felt a tangible weakness flooding my limbs. My muscles became sluggish, my mind cloudy, and my chest tightened as though gravity had increased tenfold. On one such occasion, I found myself collapsing into my reading chair, sweat gathering along my temples. My heart seemed to labor with each beat, as if it were suddenly unsure of its own rhythm. The only thing that restored my energy was winding the clock back to its correct time and watching the pendulum regain a steady, confident swing. Conversely, on the days it ran fast, even by a few seconds, I found myself unable to rest. My thoughts accelerated in a continuous loop, racing from one anxiety to another with no lull. My palms grew clammy, my breath coming in short, rapid bursts. At night, trying to sleep felt like trying to calm a frantic animal. My heart fluttered in my chest as if it were trying to match a new, disjointed pattern I'd toss and turn for hours. The clock's face looming in my mind's eye whenever I closed my own. I recall visiting a local repairman, an older gentleman who specialized in restoring vintage clocks, to see if he could recalibrate the mechanism. He attempted to open the clock's back panel only to find a baffling arrangement of gears that didn't match the usual craftsmanship. He murmured that it looked like the work of someone both ingenious and deeply unconventional. The words he used hinted at some knowledge of black magic or arcane tinkering, spoken quietly as though the clock might be listening. Unsure how to proceed, he gave a half-hearted suggestion that I contact a museum or a more specialized restorer. I thanked him but felt no relief. In the car ride home, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked drawn, almost sickly, with dark circles under my eyes. The ticking sound seemed to echo within the confined space, even though I had left the clock at home when I tried to distance myself from the clock, shutting it in a spare bedroom or covering it with a heavy cloth. My nights were plagued by fierce, suffocating nightmares. These dreams would pull me into churning darkness, my lungs constricted as if hands were wrapped around my throat, cutting off any hope for air. In those fitful visions, I could feel a presence looming behind me, whispering nonsensical incantations in a raspy voice that made my skin crawl. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat. The image of the clock's pallid face seared into my mind. Compelled by desperation, I'd retrieve the clock or uncover it, only to find myself enveloped by an unsettling sense of relief, as though I were welcoming back a dark guardian rather than casting it out. One afternoon, in a burst of resolve, I tried to rid myself of the clock altogether. I drove out to a deserted stretch of highway and placed it in the trunk of my car, determined to discard it somewhere remote. The entire trip, I fought an unsteady throb behind my temples. My arms trembled on the steering wheel as if I were waging a battle against some invisible force. Eventually, with trembling hands, I pulled over and hurled the clock into a thick patch of overgrown bushes. For a few seconds, a wave of relief washed over me, and I thought I felt my heart lighten. That night, however, the nightmares returned with a vicious intensity. In my dream, I was back in those bushes, scrabbling with frantic hands to retrieve the clock. My chest burned with each breath as if I were inhaling smoke. The presence grew more commanding, its voice droning in repetitive murmurs as I jerked awake, choking and with my nails digging into the mattress. My bedroom was swirling in half-formed shadows. Without thinking, I left my house in the middle of the night, stumbling. Through the moonlit streets to my car, I could scarcely remember my drive, but I found myself returning to that patch of bushes, rummaging in the darkness, until my hands closed around the cold wooden frame again. My heart hammered as I clutched it to my chest, feeling the clock's smooth surface pressed against my shirt. It was as though I had no choice, no free will left in the matter. Back home, I realized just how deeply its influence had grown. An odd sense of comfort welled up in my chest as I put it back on the wall. The pendulum began to sway once again, and I felt my racing pulse settle into a disturbingly synchronized pattern. That night I slept, though my dreams were filled with flickers of that gaunt-faced occultist, his painted eyes narrowing in grim amusement. Over the following days, I noticed the portrait's expression shift in subtle ways. At times, the once neutral face appeared almost pitying, as though it felt sorry for my plight. At other moments, I detected a malice around the corners of the thin lips, as if it relished my torment. I began to question my own sanity, blaming my imagination for anthropomorphizing a mere painting. But the changes were too precise, too distinct to chalk up to trickery of light or mood. Some nights, under the faint glow of the hall lamp, I would see the eyes nearly closed, forming deep creases around them as if the portrait figure was concentrating intently on me. The environmental details in my home also started to shift in unsettling ways. Rooms that once felt warm turned frigid, my breath condensing in the air. Other times, the entire house felt stifling. My skin coated in a sheen of perspiration as the walls seemed to close in around me. The floorboards, never quite silent, groaned louder and more frequently than ever before. Each creak made me flinch. Half convinced that something was moving in the shadows, I took to burning incense or lighting scented candles in the evenings, hoping to chase away the heavy atmosphere. But even their fragrant smoke appeared to drift unnaturally, collecting in corners and forming shapes that teased my peripheral vision. My own reflection in mirrors became a source of torment. I looked worn, my features drawn tight as if I were aging at a rapid pace. I'd stare into my own eyes, searching for any flicker of reassurance, but saw only fatigue and fear. Even the simplest tasks, making coffee, tidying the study, felt monumental. My heart would pound as if anticipating an inevitable confrontation lurking behind every corner. On the rare occasions I had guessed they would comment on the tension in the air. They might say quietly that the clock made them uncomfortable or that they couldn't shake a sense of being watched. One acquaintance, upon noticing the portrait's half-lidded stare, shuddered and remarked that it reminded him of an old folktale about cursed objects. He described feeling a bizarre pressure in his chest, like a mild panic attack. Though I offered a nervous laugh inside, my anxiety soared. I was glad whenever visitors left. Yet being alone amplified the silence in which the clock's relentless ticking grew louder. As the weeks passed, sleep turned into a nightly battle. I'd lie awake, heart thrumming in sync with the clock's beat. My mind spiraled in a loop of questions. Was the clock feeding off my life force? Was it inhabited by the spirit of that occultist, siphoning my essence to power its mechanism? These thoughts were ludicrous, I told myself. But every time the second hand paused, I felt a pang in my chest or a flutter in my stomach, as though my body recognized a predator's presence. Eventually, paranoia became my constant companion. I started double-locking every door, checking every window, glancing over my shoulder in my own home. The muffled echo of the pendulum followed me through the hallways, a twisted lullaby that kept me from ever feeling safe. I began to see fleeting shapes in the corners of rooms or hear faint whispers behind closed doors. My pulse would spike, sweat breaking out on my forehead. At times I was unsure if I was actually hearing anything or if my own mind was fabricating illusions. The distinction between reality and fear. Induced hallucinations blurred, fueling a deepening sense of dread. One particularly harrowing night, the clock began to run fast, extremely fast. Its second hand made a hurried dash around the face, and I felt my breath choke in my throat. My thoughts ricocheted painfully between panic and desperation. The arms of the clock seemed to stutter and skip, as if a manic energy coursed through its gears. Meanwhile, my own nerves jolted, every muscle in my body tensed until I thought I might snap. I fell to my knees in front of it, tears in my eyes, the ticking vibrating in my skull. It felt like the entire house was filled with an inaudible hum closing in and threatening to crush me from all sides. In that moment, I reached for the pendulum, intending to stop its swing once and for all. My hand shook so violently that I could scarcely grasp the brass weight. The instant my fingers brushed it, a jolt of cold power shot through my arm and I was thrown backward. In the half second before I hit the floor, I saw the portrait's expression twist with a triumphant sneer. I landed with a heavy thud, the air forced from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't draw a single breath, and the old nightmare of suffocation flooded my senses. With every fiber of will I had left, I forced myself onto my hands and knees, gulping air as if I just reached the surface of deep, dark water. That near paralysis shook me to my core. Realizing I might never break the clock's hold by sheer force, I stumbled into my study and rummaged for a heavy blanket and thick chains I'd used to secure some of my older artifacts. My plan was desperate but clear. If I couldn't destroy it, I would at least contain it. I wrapped the blanket around the clock, ignoring the persistent ticking that still managed to pierce the layers of fabric. Then I bound it tightly with the chains, my breath ragged from both terror and exertion. The final step was to seal it inside a large trunk in the basement, an old chest that was solid enough to keep a wild beast imprisoned. Or so I hoped. Even as I locked the trunk, I felt an acute chill seep up my spine like an ice-cold finger tracing each vertebra. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but for the first time in weeks, the ticking was muted to a faint erratic echo. I stood there in the basement's dim light chest, heaving. Half expecting the trunk's lid to burst open at any moment, it never did. Hours later, I dragged myself to bed, where I managed to sleep for a few short stretches without the usual horrifying visions. When nightmares did come, they were blurry and disconnected, more a swirl of anxiety than the suffocating force that had plagued me before. By dawn, I awoke with no suffocating dread. The clock's influence, while still in the background, felt subdued. In the days since I've developed a routine, periodically I go down to the basement to check on that trunk. Even from behind the chains and the locked lid, I sometimes hear a muffled rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat fighting to synchronize with my own. It's faint enough that I can ignore it most of the time, but some evenings, especially when the house is quiet, I can sense that pulse resonating through the floor. My skin prickles and I feel the echo of its presence in my chest. I still doubt my own sanity. Sometimes I wonder if the trunk truly contains the clock's malevolent force, or if I merely caged a piece of my own unraveling psyche. Certain nights I catch myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, listening to the low, hollow sound of the pendulum, or I see the memory of that portrait's gaze flicker in the corner of my eye, urging me to come closer, but I steel myself and walk away. Those who visit me now don't ask about the clock. I keep it a secret, and I can't quite bring myself to confess the entire story to anyone. After all, how could I explain that time itself, and the malevolent presence within that old ornate casing almost stole my grip on reality? I try to live with the uncertainty, never fully allowing myself to forget the threat lurking under my own roof. Yet I feel more in control, at least for the moment. Even as I sit here writing these words in my journal, the house remains oppressively silent. I can almost hear my own heartbeat over the hush. A tiny voice in the back of my mind warns me that I might have merely postponed the inevitable. But for now, I cling to this fragile peace, hoping that I've outmaneuvered whatever dark force imbued that clock. And whenever the silence grows too intense, when I can sense the faintest ticking beneath the floorboards, I remind myself to breathe slowly, deeply, refusing to let that cursed beat synchronize once more with my own story. 12, I knew something was wrong the moment the typewriter refused to remain silent. The old keys clacked by themselves long past midnight, each echo in my cramped study a hollow note of warning. Even before I read what appeared on the page, my skin prickled with anticipation. There was a charge in the air, a static tension that clung to the furniture, crawled across the walls, and settled into my lungs until every breath felt difficult. I remember standing there transfixed by the machine's ghostly rhythm, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. It was an almost inaudible scraping of ink on paper, but it carried a sense of inevitability that made my vision blur at the edges. When I finally mustered the courage to approach the typewriter's final tap reverberated, and I swear I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. I should start at the beginning. My name is Alistaster, and I've long been a writer of modest success. For years I toiled in a cramped apartment where the wallpaper had yellowed from decades of disregard, and the windows let in just enough daylight to remind me of how oppressive the space was. I cherished the solitude, at first believing it would sharpen my focus. My battered typewriter was an heirloom from my grandfather, an artifact that felt like a talisman of creativity. Its metal frame bore countless scratches, and the keys rattled with a sound that I once found comforting, like a lullaby of clinks and clangs. The first odd event happened late one evening while I was editing a short story. The lamp above me flickered, sending harsh shadows dancing across the walls. My typewriter rattled a single letter on the page, a crooked H. It startled me because my hands were nowhere near the keys. I told myself it must have been a mechanical misfire. Perhaps the tension in the keys had triggered itself. My heartbeat was still galloping in my chest, but I tried to ignore the faint sense of dread that curled in my stomach. Over the next week, whenever I tried to write, the typewriter would sporadically add words I hadn't typed. At first they were random, or so I assumed, nonsensical fragments hushed beneath. Listen. I tried to brush it off as mechanical failure, but each time I found one of those mysterious additions, my palms turned clammy and the air in my study felt colder. My arms would prickle with goosebumps, and a persistent sense of being watched from behind crept in. I'd spin around in my chair only to find the gloomy corners of the room and the battered old furniture staring back. Then came the night the typewriter produced an entire sentence on its own. I was in the kitchen rummaging for a snack when I heard the frantic clang of keys. My pulse quickened and I dashed to the study to see a single line typed in neat black letters. They will lose something precious tomorrow. A surge of panic flooded my veins, my breath suddenly shallow and uneven. I felt cornered as though the walls were looming in. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had typed it absent-minded, but my memory was clear. I hadn't pressed a single key. I was too unnerved to sleep. My body refused to relax. Sweat beaded on my forehead and my heartbeat refused to slow. Each time I closed my eyes, that sentence pounded against the darkness behind my eyelids. The next day, I tried to warn a friend about the typewriter's bizarre behavior. I hinted that something strange was happening. Some intangible doom was stirring. Yet he looked at me with confusion. I could see his face shift from concern to a vague weariness. That same day, I heard a commotion outside my apartment building. Someone had lost an important personal possession. A crowd murmured about the misfortune, but all I could think about was the typewriter's ominous warning. My arms felt weak, and the weight of realization pressed down on my chest. The event was not a direct match to the cryptic line, but it was close enough to rattle me deeply. I spent the evening trembling, haunted by that mechanical prophecy. In the following weeks, the typewriter continued to produce phrases predicting unsettling events. Each message was short and to the point, yet dripped with that inescapable sense of dread. I tried destroying the pages, tearing them to shreds, but the warnings and predictions would simply appear again when I returned to the study, typed anew as though the machine demanded an audience. My own attempts at writing became pitiful. My once evocative style turned into monotonous drill. I couldn't muster any creativity. Even as I stared at the ceiling thinking of ideas, they seemed to vanish. It was like the typewriter was siphoning my imagination, leaving me with lifeless sentences while its own output grew disturbingly ornate. Day by day, the language on those unsolicited pages became more elegant and unnerving. Whole passages formed swirling with dark metaphors of shadows and whispers. I could almost feel the typewriter's presence and intelligence behind it, feeding on my mental energy. My chest would tighten each time I approached the machine. The hairs on my arms stood on end as if the very air sizzled with electricity. One evening I touched the typewriter's metal frame and it was warm, almost feverish. That night it spelled out something about hidden doors and dreadful glimpses, and my heart raced so violently I was sure I could hear it echo off the walls. I started having nightmares. In those dreams, I would find myself in a labyrinth of corridors lit by flickering bulbs, the floor slick with some unidentifiable dampness. My footsteps echoed, yet the labyrinth remained silent. Void of any sign of life, I heard the typewriter keys tapping in the distance, guiding me deeper into a darkness I couldn't comprehend. Each time I woke with my breath-ragged sweat pouring down my temples and a twisted ache in my stomach. At one point, I tried to get rid of the typewriter. I bundled it into a box, sealed it with tape, and left it in the building's basement storage room. For 3 days, I felt a fragile sense of relief, as though I had somehow broken free of a spell. But on the fourth night, I heard the clack of keys from my study. My blood ran cold. I found the typewriter back on my desk, a new sheet of paper half filled with elaborate haunting lines about a thunderstorm approaching and a sense of betrayal in the air. When I checked the basement, the box was torn open, the tape shredded as if by furious hands. Anxiety gnawed at my insides, and I felt nauseated with every step I took. I realized there was no simple escape from whatever force controlled this thing. I grew paranoid. I was convinced that the walls had ears, that every squeak of the floorboards was a sign of something creeping around me. My reflection in the mirror looked gaunt, hollow-eyed. The overhead lights in the apartment seemed weaker, casting elongated shadows that bent at unnatural angles. I rarely left the apartment for supplies, but when I did, I felt as though invisible eyes followed me through the dimly lit hallways. My breathing became shallow, as if I were perpetually on the brink of panic. I tried writing about other subjects. Flowers, the ocean, laughter, anything to distract myself. But the words on my own pages fell flat and colorless. Meanwhile, the typewriter's messages grew disturbingly poetic, describing swirling vortexes of gloom and illusions that danced in the corners of one's vision. Every so often, I'd think about telling the building manager or my neighbors that something bizarre was happening. But the predictions on the pages had taught me a bitter lesson. Each time I tried to intervene, fate twisted itself into a horrifying shape. If the typewriter wrote something about a revelation or a confrontation, and I warned others a different but equally unsettling event would occur. Once the typewriter forecasted a violent disruption of the night's calm, I tried to notify the neighbor above me, speaking to him in a hushed tone about a potential break-in. That night there was no break-in. Instead, the neighbor's entire ceiling collapsed under a strange structural failure. The resulting crash rattled every wall in the building, but no one was harmed. Still, the sense of terror that spread through the corridors was palpable. I remember how my hands quivered uncontrollably after hearing the thunderous collapse, how the floor felt like it vibrated with some unholy energy. It was almost as though the machine was feeding off the drama it created, mutating each warning into something different when I tried to stop it. With each new event, the typewriter script grew more elaborate, weaving verses about creeping dread illusions that shimmered just outside the realm of sight, and moments that threatened to twist one's sanity. My heart pounded whenever I neared the thing. The sensation of being suffocated by an invisible force became constant. The walls seemed closer than before, as though the entire apartment was shrinking around me. One night I found a particularly haunting paragraph waiting for me on a fresh sheet of paper. It spoke of a labyrinth of reflections and a withered voice that commands the unspoken. Its language was so enthrallingly dark that I felt a cold shiver course through my veins. My lungs constricted and each inhale burned my throat. The presence in the room was almost tangible. I glanced at the shadows in the corners, half expecting them to slither across the floor. A faint tapping seemed to reverberate through the walls, an almost inaudible heartbeat that matched my own but slowed and deepened as if luring me into a slumber I might never wake from. I grew desperate, although I dared not try to warn anyone specifically about the words anymore. I sought help in a more general sense. I mentioned to a close acquaintance that I was experiencing strange mechanical glitches and a creeping sense of dread. In hushed, frantic mutterings, I hinted I felt haunted, yet even as I spoke, it felt like the words were drained of impact. My friend seemed sympathetic, but the conversation was filled with awkward silence, as if something was gently preventing me from explaining too much. That night, the typewriter hammered out an even longer, more sinister passage that ended with, "Your warnings only sharpened my appetite." Physically, I was unraveling. My mouth constantly felt dry, no matter how much water I drank. My legs shook. If I stood for too long, I could sense a perpetual chill creeping from my toes to my spine. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and there were moments when my vision blurred, distorting the edges of the room into swirling shapes. Light fixtures seemed dimmer by the day, casting faint, sickly glows that barely held back the shadows. The building's corridors smelled stale like mildew and old books. The air was thick, almost tactile. Each footstep rang out as if amplified, and I felt watched by something more pervasive than a mere stranger's gaze. Eventually, I resolved I needed to confront the machine directly. One evening, I prepared myself mentally, trying to gather any last remnants of courage I had. My heart was pounding so hard I could practically hear the blood coursing in my veins. I sat before the typewriter with a fresh sheet of paper. My fingers trembled on the keys. I was determined to wrest control of the narrative, to write a story of hope, or at least to outpour all the fear I felt in a single torrent of words. Yet every sentence came out flat, a droning repetition of cliches that lacked the creative spark I once wielded. It was as if the machine had consumed my talent, leaving me with only the skeletal remains of what used to be language. Then the typewriter began typing beneath my frozen fingers. I watched the keys move, almost hypnotized. It spelled out a single directive that sent ice through my bloodstream. Search the corners. My breathing quickened, and each shaky exhale was a shallow rasp. The air around me felt thin as though there was no oxygen left. A faint static hiss filled my ears. Clutching a flashlight, I forced myself to examine the corners of my study, the neglected angles where dust had accumulated in thick layers. The beam of light shook with each trembling motion of my hand. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of a presence lurking beyond the edges of my vision. My entire body was slick with sweat, and my heart thudded so violently that I thought it might burst from my chest. I felt compelled to move to the hallway to check the corners there as well. Every step felt like trudging through liquid dread. My pulse was a relentless drumbeat in my ears, and the world around me threatened to spin out of control. I searched corner after corner, hallway after hallway, until I reached the end of the corridor leading to the storage room. The overhead light flickered half-heartedly, illuminating the worn brick walls. Something about the air felt thicker there. A stale, almost suffocating heaviness pressed into my lungs. Again, there was nothing concrete to see, just a bleak patch of darkness that my flickering flashlight failed to dispel. Yet I sensed something intangible, a simmering energy or presence that seemed to hum with ominous purpose. My hand shook so violently that the flashlight beam jittered across the floor. Determination replaced my terror for a moment. I turned back and strode into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My plan was to banish that cursed typewriter once and for all. Another wave of adrenaline pulsed through me. My breath came in ragged gasps. My arms felt cold, yet my forehead burned with sweat. Without hesitation, I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer. The typewriter sat on the desk, silent and unassuming. The single page with the words, "Search the corners," still in place. A wild impulse surged through my muscles. I struck the typewriter with all my might. The sound of metal cracking under the hammer was deafening each impact, sending jolts up my arms until my shoulders ached. When I finished, the typewriter lay in a ruin of twisted metal and shattered keys. My chest heaved and the room spun as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, the silence felt like a reprieve, a fragile hush that settled on my battered mind. But then I noticed something. The desk drawer rattled. My pulse spiked and that cold wave of dread returned stronger than ever. With shaking hands, I inched the drawer open. Inside was a stack of fresh paper, pristine and white. The top sheet bore a single line, written in the same elegantly ominous style as before. "You only fed me more." A suffocating weight pressed on my chest. It felt as though the air turned solid, pinning me in place. There was no more typewriter, but the message remained. In that moment, I realized the dark intelligence was not in the machine itself. It had taken root somewhere else, perhaps in the pages or in my mind or in the very walls of the apartment. I couldn't stay there. The walls were suffocating, the shadows crawling with new intensity. My heart pounded like it wanted to escape my rib cage. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and every instinct screamed at me to flee. I stuffed some clothes into a bag, grabbed the stack of paper. A nervous compulsion made me do it as if I couldn't leave it behind, and rushed into the hallway. As I stepped into the corridor, the building lights flickered erratically and a low hum that seemed to resonate from the pipes under the floors vibrated the air around me. Each step felt labored, my throat burning from the cold dryness. I made my way outside, ignoring the bewildered stares of a couple of neighbors. My only goal was to escape that building and whatever had latched onto me. The night air was heavy with humidity, a stark contrast to the cold dryness inside. I climbed into my car, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away from the curb, I felt no relief, only a lingering sense that something was still with me. My eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch a glimpse of a shape in the back seat. The mirror reflected only darkness, but I knew I was not free. Now, as I write this from a temporary motel room miles away, the oppressive atmosphere lingers. I hear faint tapping in the silence, a phantom echo of keys striking paper. My attempts to write have improved only slightly, but each word I type feels like it's draining me. Sometimes I catch the reflection of a single phrase in the glare of my laptop screen, something that seems to shimmer and vanish before I can read it. I sense that the malevolent force still lurks, feeding on my creativity, growing more elaborate in the recesses of my mind. I keep the pages from the desk drawer locked away in a small safe, hoping that physical distance might mute whatever entity was awakened. Yet my nights remain restless, riddled with nightmares of labyrinthine hallways and cold metal keys that type by themselves. I have no proof that I've escaped its grip, only the fragile hope that maybe if I never touch another typewriter I can slip away from the darkness it conjured. Even that hope falters in the dead of night when the room is silent and a soft clacking resonates in the corner of my imagination. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I feel that I stand on the precipice of a very dark place, but I have survived thus far with no casualties to speak of, only the constant presence of dread nipping at my mind. Perhaps that is the most horrible victory this entity can claim. The slow unraveling of my sanity. I may never fully understand the nature of this phenomenon. All I can do is remain vigilant, question every shadow, listen for every stray echo of tapping keys, and pray that my creative spark, however diminished, doesn't ignite something far worse lurking behind the veil. Story 13. The first night I heard it, the sound drifted down the corridor like a memory that refused to fade. 3 measured raps on the baseboard, followed by the unmistakable click-tap of a cane striking hardwood. I froze in the workshop doorway, spine rigid, fingers slick with varnish. No wind rattled the windows, no pipes groaned in the walls. The house simply breathed around me, hushed and expectant, as if it knew something I did not. I rent the top floor of an 1890s townhouse, partly for the north-facing skylight that bathes my restoration bench in cold daylight, partly for the silence. Antique clocks and picture frames require concentration. Any stray vibration can jolt a fragile mechanism or crack-flaking guilt. Tonight, though the silence felt carnivorous, I could almost hear my pulse pounding against my eardrums, a frantic metronome counting down to something unseen. I swallowed, tasting dust and walnut oil. The hallway stretched ahead like a throat, narrow and dim. I forced 1 foot forward, joints stiff, lungs tight. The cane struck again. Tap, pause, tap closer now, as though whoever wielded it paced just beyond the bend. My breath shortened, the skin on my arms contracted, every hair rising in cold salute. The footsteps ceased. I reached the corner and snapped on the sconce. Empty floorboards stared back, warped and dull beneath the weak bulb. A laugh almost escaped me. Thin, brittle, embarrassed. But another sensation clamped it shut. An aroma faint yet unmistakable. Bay rum cologne, the kind my grandfather kept in a green glass bottle, lingering like stale liquor on his shaving brush. The scent hovered, then thinned into nothing. I slept poorly, sheets damp with sweat. At 3:17 a.m., a sharp pressure dipped the mattress beside my hip as if a heavy body had settled there. I lay rigid, tasting metal on my tongue, heart rattling against the cage of my ribs. The impression lasted maybe 10 seconds before the weight lifted. I did not look. I did not dare. Morning brought rational excuses. Old houses creak, neighbors move at odd hours. Scents cling to fabric. I repeated the litany while cataloging a set of Art Nouveau picture frames. Yet my palms trembled enough to leave greasy crescents on the inventory sheet. That afternoon, as sun slanted through the skylight, I reached for my favorite sable brush and found the entire tray of tools scrambled. Burnishers slid under gouges. Chisels lay edge up as if invisible hands had foraged and left in haste. I swore softly, stomach twisting, I live alone. On the third night, the sounds resumed, louder, purposeful. Wood floor cane, wood floor, always the same rhythm, relentless, patient. When I flicked on the hall, light silence blossomed. The cologne drifted around me like a taunt. I needed proof, something tangible to dissect. An old Polaroid flash unit lay in my equipment trunk, useful for photographing minute cracks before restoration. Near midnight, I stationed myself at the hallway threshold. camera raised index finger trembling on the shutter. The footsteps approached the taps, measuring my fear. When they felt near enough to graze, I pressed the button. White light exploded, searing after images into my retinas. The square film slid out with a hiss. I stared at the dark rectangle while my heartbeat slowed from sprint to jog. As shapes bloomed on the developing surface, cold prickled across my scalp. There, faint but definite, stood a tall silhouette in a long coat. Head tilted, the cane gripped like a scepter. No features, only depthless shadow. Yet I sensed its gaze boring straight through the lens at me. I dropped the photo. It slapped the floor, face-up silent accusation. The next days blurred into clenched daylight and vigilant nights. I worked little, ate less. Each evening the entity roamed rustling drawers, nudging furniture, exhaling that antique scent until the air in every room tasted of history. I began locking the workshop. Though I understood deadbolts meant nothing to whatever walked with a cane, yet left no footprints. Sleep deteriorated into snatches. I'd startle awake to the mattress sinking beside me. Muscles locked breath, rasping teeth sharp through parted lips. My eyes fixed on the ceiling refused to slide sideways, terrified of what waited only inches away. Sometimes the cane clicked once against the floorboards before the weight vanished, as if my paralysis amused it. Paranoia seeped into daylight. In shops, I scanned reflections, expecting that tall outline behind me. Subway brakes screeched like cane taps. Colleagues noticed my jumpiness, my hollow stare. I lied about stress and deadlines, but my sweat smelled of fear. One afternoon, digging for distraction, I inspected a battered steamer trunk I bought at an estate sale months prior and forgotten in a corner. Inside underwool blankets lay a single object wrapped in yellowed linen, a silver-handled cane topped with a lion's head. Tarnish dulled its surface, but the design matched the silhouette's outline with sickening precision. My throat constricted. I pictured the ghost rifling my workshop, seeking the very stick now snug in my trembling hands. A rational impulse whispered, "Dispose of it." Yet another voice, low and intimate, suggested that returning the cane might end the haunting nightfall. Found me seated at the workbench, polishing the silver, restoring the ebony shaft fingertips tingling with gooseflesh every time the metal glinted. As I worked, the house remained eerily quiet, as though the figure watched satisfied. Finished near midnight, I set the cane upright in the center of the hallway and retreated to the far wall. The silence felt thick enough to bite. My lungs drew shallow, deliberate breaths. Sweat trickled behind my ears. Minutes crawled. Nothing happened. Relief fluttered until the overhead bulb flickered, then dimmed to orange. The air cooled. A soft tread sounded not from the hallway, but from my bedroom door at the opposite end. Tap wood. Tap. The silhouette emerged darker than the shadows it passed through, head bent toward the floor as if tracking scent. It reached the cane fingers, blacker than space, curving around the silver handle. A sigh floated across the corridor, warm and moist, carrying concentrated bay rum. My knees nearly buckled. The figure straightened. Though it possessed no eyes, I felt its stare pierce me. Dissecting skin from sinew, cold blossomed inside my chest. My heartbeat stuttered, then raced, pounding hard enough to blur my vision. The figure inclined its head, a silent nod of acknowledgement, gratitude, triumph, then turned toward the stairwell. With each step, floorboards complained under an impossible weight. The cane tapped in perfect cadence. I pressed against the plaster, every muscle, thrumming spine rigid against the wall. The entity paused midway down the stairs and lifted the cane a fraction, almost a salute. Light crashed. The bulb above me shattered in a spray of hot glass, plunging the hallway into darkness. I smelled singed filament, then nothing at all. When I flicked every switch in the apartment, wiring responded. Lamps glowed, but the house felt hollow. No aroma, no footsteps, no weight on the bed that night. Dawn cracked across the skyline like relief I dared to hope. For 2 days peace reigned. I aired rooms, aired myself, convinced the ordeal was finished. On the third morning, I found the Polaroid lying face down on my kitchen table. I had locked it in a desk drawer. My fingers shook as I flipped it over. The hallway scene remained, yet the silhouette had vanished, leaving only the cane propped alone beside the wall. That night, the tapping resumed, faint distant beneath the floorboards, as though the figure paced in rooms below that do not exist. At times I catch whiffs of cologne drifting up through the vents. Objects occasionally migrate. A watch move too in a drawer partly open. Each incident is small, almost courteous, but together they stitch a shroud around my nerves. I considered moving, yet the sensation clings to me even on crowded streets. A presence keeping pace a step behind Kane, silent against concrete. Once standing in a store's mirrored pillar, I glimpsed the tall outline over my shoulder. Featureless face inches above mine, then blinked it away. My scalp prickled for hours. I have learned to endure the nightly sounds, the distant knocks, the slow tread, the hushed inspection of my possessions. Sleep comes in shallow pools, fear coats my tongue like copper. But I sense a pattern. The entity searches, still restless, dissatisfied. Perhaps the cane was never its true quarry. Perhaps I merely handed it a tool. Last week I set up a digital recorder overnight, on playback beneath the cadence of footsteps, a dry whisper threaded through the static. I replayed it until words surfaced, dredged from the hiss, not yet still missing. My stomach clenched so hard I nearly retched. Now each dusk I line the hallway with restored antiques, hoping to appease the seeker. Silver frames, ivory letter openers, mother-of-pearl snuff boxes, all pristine. The silhouette appears less often, yet when it does, it examines each item with patient, proprietary grace before moving on. I watch from the threshold, heart, racing sweat cooling against my ribs. Tonight as I write this, the house is silent. The air smells faintly of bay rum. My bedroom door just clicked open. I feel pressure dent the mattress beside me. Gentle but insistent, as though someone sits to read over my shoulder. Keys clatter. The screen glows, words form without my touch. Keep looking. My mouth dries to parchment. I am no longer certain whose hands type these lines. Somewhere behind me, a cane taps once. A soft reminder that the search continues and that I am part of it now, willingly or not. The room feels smaller, the night deeper, my own breath harsher against the walls. I close my eyes, yet see him still tall and waiting, always waiting. And in the darkness between heartbeats, I understand the most unsettling truth. Some antiques cannot be restored, only awakened.